Hey, if you're new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It would really mean a lot to me, and honestly, it'd make my day. If you already did, thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, if you like listening to fan fiction, check out my other channel. The link's in the description.
One Piece Legends by xAlreadyOverx. Luffy dreams of becoming the queen of the pirates, not just to find the One Piece, but to prove Shanks wrong after he told her she could never be king. Armed with the powers of the gum-gum fruit and a fierce determination, she set sail despite her inability to swim, relying on her loyal crew and trusted first mate to survive the dangers of the Grand Line. But as the journey unfolds, Luffy begins to experience strange, unfamiliar feelings, especially whenever her stoic swordsman is near. Could it be more than just friendship? Or is this just one more mystery waiting to be unraveled on the high seas? And before we start, a massive shout out to the warlords of this channel: Case Clark, Leaf5_SCXR, Tristan Ward. You three are the backbone of this community. Your support means the world. Seriously, thank you for standing with me. If you want to join the ranks of these legends, hit that join button and become a channel member today. Let's grow this thing together. Much love, and as always, adios.
Realizations, arguments, and Zoro's past. It was another calm day, something that Nami was getting used to seeing during her time with the Straw Hat Pirates. The sun had crested the horizon and was shining brightly across the sea as waves crashed lightly against the side of the ship, and there was not a cloud in sight. The Orangeette stretched her arms above her head with a yawn as she left the storage room, blinking her eyes against the bright blue sky. After their party last night to celebrate Usopp's joining, the navigator had claimed the captain's quarters at the rear of the ship as her and Luffy's bedroom. She had insisted that they have separate quarters now that they had an actual ship, and, surprisingly, Zoro had agreed with her. Even though he had gotten used to waking up with Luffy using him as a makeshift pillow, these past 2 days had shaken him slightly. He craved contact with her, even more than he used to, and actually had to keep himself from pulling her into a hug every time the raven-haired girl said something silly or gave him a cute look. Because of these growing feelings and urges, Zoro wasn't sure how smart it was to have the object of his confusion sleeping in the same bed hammock, whatever they had as him anymore. Luffy had pouted slightly at that, trying to argue against it. She thought that the hammock room was cooler than the small girly bedroom at the back and didn't particularly like being told that she would be confined to it at night. The Straw Hat Girl had eventually given up arguing with the navigator and had proceeded to ignore both Zoro and Nami in retribution. Instead, she sat and talked with Usopp, pretending as if she didn't hear the other two. It was a childish thing to do, Nami had thought, and the Orangeette had just rolled her eyes at the younger girl's antics. Zoro, on the other hand, had not taken kindly to being ignored by his captain, especially when she was ignoring him for Usopp of all people, and the swordsman had spent the rest of the evening with a scowl on his face and a constant glare directed at the long-nosed teen. Usopp had quickly felt Zoro's glare and had quickly drank himself into oblivion, as Nami just watched the swordsman's obvious jealousy fester. Honestly, the two of them were such high maintenance. Speaking of, Nami grinned, pulling herself out of her thoughts when she noticed Usopp sitting gingerly on the stairs that led to the bow of the ship, his head in his hands. "Drink too much?" the Orangeette chuckled, crossing her arms over her chest as she watched the other teen let out a soft groan of acknowledgement. Usopp's face was pale and he looked absolutely sick as he absently rubbed at his temples in an effort to dull the pounding in his head. "Stupid, angry, scary swordsman." Nami sighed, taking pity on the sniper, and lowered her voice as she continued. "Luffy's enthusiasm is probably not helping it either, right?" Usopp glanced up at Nami from between his fingers with a frown on his face, wincing when another throb shot through his head. "Luffy's not up yet. Thank God." The sniper wasn't sure that he could handle the raven-haired girl's energy at the moment, although he could always hope that she was hungover as well. After all, she had drank almost as much as Zoro, and that was saying something. That man drank sake like water and was twice as big as Luffy, so the tiny captain was almost certainly as bad off as Usopp, if not worse. Nami just frowned at Usopp's words, glancing around the deck in an attempt to spot the raven-haired girl, not quite believing the long-nosed teen's words. "Luffy often slept in late, but she wasn't in the bedroom when I woke up though, so where?" Her gaze turned back to Usopp as she slowly began to fit the pieces together, fighting the urge to bang her head against a wall. And the long-nosed teen just gave her a raised eyebrow and a, "Are you really that surprised?" kind of look. No, she really wasn't. I wonder how Zoro will take this after being so adamant about her sleeping in another room last night. Not that I don't get why he wanted Luffy away from him, at least for a bit, but I seriously do not envy that man. Nami sighed, finally voicing her thoughts as she dropped her head into her hand and shook it slightly. This morning was probably going to turn out to be kind of interesting. Zoro couldn't remember the last time he had that much to drink. It had probably been back when he still traveled with Johnny and Yosaku, but he was still proud to say that his tolerance for alcohol had not dimmed in the least. Zoro's chest clenched in frustration, bringing him slowly back to consciousness, as he remembered his reason for drinking so much in the first place. Not that the alcohol hadn't been good, but he had been so annoyed with Luffy that he just kept downing bottle after bottle in an effort to banish the swirling thoughts that her actions were causing. She had been acting so childish last night, but for some reason, he had been angrier with the sniper talking to her than with the girl herself. The swordsman groaned slightly, banishing those thoughts, as light shone through the hatch that led up to the deck, waking him more from what had been a particularly good rest. Since he had escaped from the Shellstown base with Luffy, he had been either sleeping at the bottom of a small boat or on the ground. It was nice to sleep on something soft for once, even if it was a couch. Speaking of soft, Zoro cracked his eyes open slowly as he felt the warm lump pressed into his side wiggle slightly, mind fighting through the haze of sleepiness. Zoro. Shish. Lu. He absently soothed the girl's small whine as his eyes slipped closed again, pulling the small girl closer to him in an effort to make himself more comfortable. He took a deep breath as his face settled into her hair, relaxing at the familiar scent of wild orchids and a soft sea salt breeze that was uniquely Luffy. His mind began to drift off again, content, the familiar sleeping arrangements convincing him to relax and slip back into blissful sleep. There was almost a minute of calm relaxation, the swordsman mere seconds from sleep, before his eyes suddenly snapped open and focused on the raven-haired mop snuggled against his collarbone. Gah! With a shout that roused Luffy from her comfortable place on her first mate's chest, Zoro flailed backwards, shoving the girl off of the couch and onto the wooden floor and causing her to let out a grunt of pain as she slammed into the small coffee table in the center of the room. From up on deck, both Nami and Usopp heard the cry and subsequent crash and turned their gazes towards the hold before both sighed heavily. "I think he's awake now," Nami muttered, shaking her head softly. Her eyes watched the hatch to the hold with an almost pitying expression. Usopp didn't say anything back, just nodded, a sympathetic look on his own face. Nami sighed as she rolled up one of the charts that Mary had given her, sliding it carefully back into its holding tube before setting it to the side and glancing around the deck. It had been eerily quiet since Zoro and Luffy had woken up, the little argument they had gotten into notwithstanding. Flashback, "Damn it, Luffy. What the hell were you doing?" Zoro growled, climbing out of the hold and stomping across the deck, the loud movement making Usopp hold his head in pain as each step caused his temples to throb. Seriously, were none of them hung over like he was? How was that possible? They were monsters, that had to be it. "I was sleeping," Luffy replied, tilting her head curiously as she rested her arms on the edge of the hold, not climbing fully out onto the deck. She didn't seem to understand Zoro's question fully and looked at her first mate, concerned. "Did Zoro have a nightmare? Is that why he yelled?" she asked. She pouted, moving one hand to rub at the back of her head, wincing when her fingers hit the forming bruise on her skull. "I hit the stupid table thing." Zoro turned to face the raven-haired girl at her mumble and made a small half-movement toward wince. It was almost ingrained now, the need to make sure that she was okay, to protect her, and his hands twitched at his sides. He wanted to run his fingers through her hair and check the injury for himself, but his eyes caught sight the bandages still wrapped on her upper arms and he forced himself to stand still. Zoro shook his head in an attempt to bring himself back to the matter at hand. "No, Luffy. I didn't have a nightmare," the swordsman sighed. "Why weren't you sleeping in your room? We talked about this last night. Now that we have a ship, you and Nami have your own room." He was exasperated, having not planned on waking up so suddenly or in such a situation. But really, Zoro knew he should have expected something like this. Luffy hardly ever listened to him on a regular basis. Why did he think she would listen to something when she didn't want to do it in the first place? No. Luffy pointed a finger at the swordsman, her eyes narrowing with anger. You guys talked about it. As captain, I chose to ignore you. Her voice was sharp and both Usopp and Nami flinched slightly away from the normally bubbly captain, not used to seeing this side of her. Zoro just stood his ground, knowing that Luffy wasn't mad. After all, he knew his captain best. That tone of voice and the expression on her face, he knew that his captain was more hurt than angry. He scratched the back of his head in annoyance, feeling himself start to cave. He just couldn't stay mad at her for too long and it was making him angry at himself. I can sleep wherever I want. It's my ship and I like sleeping with Zoro. Luffy continued, nodding, the movement having a sense of finality to it, as if there would be no more debate and the raven-haired girl's word was law. Zoro's teeth ground together even as a blush spread across his face at Luffy's words. He didn't know why he was arguing this so heavily, why having Luffy so near him was such a bad thing. Why couldn't they go back a week to the time when having Luffy use him for a pillow, without all these messy and confusing feelings getting in the way? Damn those Nyaban brothers for changing everything. He had been happy with the way things were when it was just Luffy and him. Zoro watched as Luffy finally climbed out of the hold and shut the hatch carefully behind her before moving to stand in front of Zoro with her arms crossed. She watched her swordsman with a look that practically screamed, "I dare you to argue with me." The green-haired swordsman felt like screaming and hitting a wall at that look. He was supposed to be angry with her, annoyed that she was continuing to win such a petty argument, but all Zoro could feel was an urge to pinch her cheek and force her frown into a grin, distract her. He wanted to grab the Straw Hat Girl, throw her over his shoulder, and start a game of tag or something. Anything to break the argument without him having to outright lose to the tiny pirate captain. His anger with himself grew as he felt Luffy slip more under his skin and he growled, "Stupid, childish, beautiful, obnoxious girl." But Zoro refused to give up. He was the famous pirate hunter of the East Blue, damn it. Regardless of the fact that Luffy was his captain, he would not back down against a girl that was half his size. His pride wouldn't let him. Luffy opened her mouth to keep speaking and Zoro knew that he would crumble under her next words, so he quickly cut her off and said the first thing that came to his mind. "Well, I don't want you to sleep near me. I don't want you in my room, so sleep in your own damn bed." As soon as the words left his mouth, Zoro regretted them. He had never been one for words, had never been good at getting his feelings across, and to speak without thinking was 10 times worse. He hadn't meant to yell at Luffy. Hell, the words that came out of his mouth weren't even true, but she just frustrated him so much sometimes. He couldn't think straight around her and it confused him more than anything. Zoro had spent his life training to be the best and to have something render him so completely insecure and almost helpless without even giving him the chance to fight back angered him immensely. Luffy's expression faltered, her arms dropping to her sides as her whole body just seemed to deflate at his words. Her eyes were shiny, as if she was about to cry, and she watched Zoro with a sad and somewhat hurt look on her face. After a few seconds of silence, she took a deep breath and nodded jerkily. "Oh, okay. Sorry, Zoro. I didn't mean, we've just been, sorry." Without another word, the Straw Hat Captain turned and made her way past where Usopp and Nami were watching the argument with shocked expressions on their faces. Neither could believe what had just happened. That Zoro, had just yelled at Luffy and told her to stay away from him. Nami's gaze was almost horrified as she stared at the green-haired swordsman, seeing a similar expression mirrored on his face. Usopp had turned to watch as Luffy passed and was following the girl with his eyes as she walked slowly towards the front of the ship before silently and a little unsteadily pulling herself up and onto the ramp figurehead when she got near enough. Zoro's eyes were glued onto Luffy's retreating frame, watching her move further and further away from him. His mouth was hanging open and his eyes were wide as if he couldn't believe what had just come out of his own mouth. Usopp had started swinging his head between Luffy's slumped back and Zoro's shocked face, unable to keep his eyes on just one person and stubbornly ignoring the pain that throbbed in his head as he did. Even after just knowing them for a few days, Usopp could easily see the relationship that the captain and first mate had. It was one of those obvious things that was almost straight out of one of Kaya's romance novels. To see the swordsman, the man who had reacted so harshly to Butchie just holding Luffy, yell at her himself in such a harsh way. The sniper couldn't believe it, and he wasn't the only one. Nami's horrified expression had melted away into a furious glare and she stormed towards Zoro, unable to believe what he had just done. The Oranget punched his arm as hard as she could before smacking him upside the head multiple times. "You stupid, idiotic, moron," she hissed, keeping her voice down so that Luffy couldn't hear her. She knew that the raven-haired girl would just defend Zoro, no matter what he had done. Luffy never could stay angry with someone for too long and Nami needed to smack some sense into the green-haired swordsman. "What the hell was that? Did you see her face? How could you do that to Luffy? Why would you even think that after everything you two have been together? Were you even thinking?" With every word the navigator spoke, Zoro's serious and almost destroyed expression deepened until he could no longer look the Oranget in the eyes. His gaze slid to the side and passed over Luffy, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs at the sight of her looking so sad, before he closed his eyes in defeat. Nami just shook her head, pinching the bridge of her nose in exasperation as she watched Zoro struggle. "You two have been sleeping together, in the same bed, since you started sailing together," Nami began, causing Zoro's ears to turn a little pink at her wording, but the swordsman still refused to look at her. "I mean, this is Luffy we're talking about, damn it. You know how childish and naive she can be at times. Do you really think that she understands the reason that we want separate rooms? Sleeping is just sleeping to her. You know that?" The navigator shook her head in exasperation. "She probably thinks that you hate her or something like that now, so nice going." Zoro flinched slightly at that. The idea of Luffy thinking that he hated her caused a lump to form in his throat. Nami noticed the swordsman's discomfort and quickly drove her point home. "So, Mr. Pirate Hunter, you need to get whatever has gotten you so worked up under control and apologize to Luffy. I don't care what is going through your idiot, don't you dare take it out on her." Nami stepped back and crossed her arms over her chest, glancing back at Luffy and then up at the sun before turning back to Zoro. "And you better do it by lunchtime or I will personally throw you overboard." The last statement was said with a snarl because Nami was starting to get a little protective of the raven-haired girl. The longer she hung around Luffy and the more time she spent with the girl, the more she thought of the goofy kid as a younger sister that needed protecting, and the Oranget wouldn't hesitate to put the girl's moron of a first mate in his place if he did anything to hurt her. Zoro just glared at the Oranget, finally able to look her in the eye again, and started muttering under his breath about being ordered around by annoying women. Eventually he sighed and turned away from Nami's accusing glare, making his way towards the back of the ship, the complete opposite direction of Luffy. Nami was about to yell at him again but stopped when she saw him shoot one last sad look at his captain's hunched frame before the swordsman scratched his head, sighed, and disappeared behind the galley, presumably to think. End flashback. Nami sighed as she pulled herself out of her memories and glanced up at the sky, taking in the sight of the sun almost directly above her. It was almost midday now and Zoro still hadn't budged from his place on the roof of the galley. He was lying down, using his arms as pillows for his head, his swords placed a few feet away from him. Nami would have thought that he was sleeping if it wasn't for the constant flicker of his eyelids and the occasional tensing of his arms, that indicated that the swordsman was definitely awake. The navigator had no idea what was running through the moss-headed idiot's brain or what he was thinking about so hard, but she hoped that he would hurry up. Her eyes moved to Luffy, who was still sitting at the bow of the ship, the raven-haired girl's shoulders slumped forward and her head downcast. She looked completely put out, even worse than when Buggy had ripped her hat, and it saddened Nami. "Men," the Oranget thought, shaking her head as she stood up and made her way towards the galley door. She would never understand them. Nami stopped just before she entered the room and glared up at the roof, willing herself to see Zoro past the wood that blocked her view. "And I'll be charging Zoro double for his meal today, regardless of if he apologizes to Luffy." Zoro sighed and slowly opened his eyes as he felt the navigator's glare drill into him. He knew how badly he had screwed up. Luffy's crushed expression that was branded into his mind was proof enough. Hell, they shouldn't have been arguing in the first place. It was stupid and petty, and as much as Zoro hated to admit it, Nami had been right. He was just taking his anger out on Luffy, and that was something that he never wanted to do, something that he never thought that he would do. He couldn't get the image of Luffy unconscious in Butchie's hold out of his mind. The way his chest had tightened and his anger had flared at the sight. The hot jealousy and disgust that shot through his veins at the sight of the man pawing at his captain, his Luffy, like he owned her. She was his. He had made that point clear when he fought Kabaji, and… Shit. Zoro paled slightly at the direction his thoughts had turned. He remembered boys from the dojo talking about girls they had crushes on and the anger they felt when the girl would talk to other boys. At the time, Zoro had thought all of that stuff was stupid. To let yourself get worked up by something like that was just dumb in his mind, and he had made his opinion clear, which ended up resulting in a lot of fights against boys that were older than him. It had been good practice for Zoro. But now, hell, he still thought it was stupid to let yourself get worked up like that, and here he was doing the exact same thing. He didn't have time for crap like that. All that he needed to focus on was getting strong enough to be the greatest swordsman in the whole world, strong enough to beat Hawkeye's Mihawk. Zoro let out a groan and smacked his head lightly against the wood beneath him when Luffy's smiling face flashed through his mind. He just needed to beat Mihawk, that was it. So why was it that when he thought of his dream, his goal, the little straw hat wearing she pirate came to mind? The world's greatest swordsman sounds good to me. The queen of the pirates wouldn't have anything less than the best on her crew. That bright smile she had given him when he had told her of his dream. There was no disbelief, no judgment in her gaze. Her immediate faith in him was what had first caused Zoro to think that there was more to the grinning raven-haired girl than he had originally thought. The longer he traveled with her, the more she surprised him, encouraged him, inspired him. The more he came to rely on the tiny girl with the bright smile. Now, in his head, he couldn't see himself without her. His goal was no longer separate from hers. Zoro knew that he wouldn't be the world's greatest swordsman if Luffy wasn't standing beside him as the queen of the pirates. It was as simple as that. Zoro chuckled softly to himself as images of Luffy's pouting face flashed through his mind. The time when Buggy had claimed that he would be the pirate king and Luffy was forced to correct him. The pout that the clown man's statement had caused and the shocked looks she left behind when she told him how it was really going to be. After all, Luffy would be the queen of the pirates if Zoro had anything to say about it. He loved the silly look she got on her face, the genuine confusion in her gaze when people couldn't seem to understand her motive for things. He had never had any trouble understanding her, and her smile had always brightened when she realized that he knew her plan without her having to say it. Zoro cherished that smile and ruffled her hair or even praised her just to see it grow even brighter. He loved her, he loved Luffy in every silly sentence, every confused expression, every stupid idea she ever had. Zoro honestly couldn't pinpoint the moment when that had happened, when Luffy's happiness and well-being had become so important to him. He wasn't stupid like those teenagers at the dojo that he had fought with all those years ago. He didn't believe in love at first sight or anything like that, but he honestly couldn't remember when seeing her smile had become one of the best parts of his day. Zoro quickly tried to think back, flipping through every memory he had of them in an effort to try and figure it out. He remembered the worry, relief, and exasperation he had felt upon seeing her in Buggy's cage. Even back then she had been important to him. The idea of leaving her, it was unthinkable in his mind, and he had felt his chest clench in worry when she first told him to run. He had to assume it was before that then. Maybe during the time they were sailing together, that time when she fell off of the boat. But Zoro remembered being slightly worried about her even back when they were fighting Captain Morgan. So the swordsman scratched his head in annoyance and forced himself into a sitting position before shaking his head slightly. What did it matter when he had fallen in love with her? It wasn't like knowing the exact moment would change anything. He knew he did love her now and had absolutely no idea what to do with it. His gaze drifted to the bow of the ship, eyes filling with regret at the sight of Luffy still sitting there. She hadn't budged from that spot going on 3 hours now, and it just wasn't like her. She was always moving, always exploring everything around her, and often fell overboard on their tiny boat because of it. Her enthusiasm and excitement was just a part of who she was. Now though. Shit. Zoro let out a slight groan, the hand in his hair moving to cover his eyes. What was he supposed to do? To say? His thoughts were rushing through his head as he tried to think of some way to apology good with words, so how could he explain it to her without? I love you, Luffy. Zoro shook his head again, squeezing his hands into fists and smacking himself lightly in the forehead with one. Absolutely not. He was not telling her. Ever. Luffy wouldn't understand what he meant by it. She would just think that he loved her like any of their crew. Like Nami had said, his captain was naive. In Zoro's mind, it was one of her best qualities, the ability she had to see the simple side of things and the good in people. He didn't want to be the one responsible for taking that away, for changing her, and he knew that love, and what came from it, would change her. Why wouldn't it? He didn't want her to lose that innocence and naivety, but, at the same time, he couldn't leave Luffy thinking that he was mad at her. He could never be truly angry with Luffy. Exasperated or annoyed at times, but never angry. So how was he going to do this? With a resigned sigh, Zoro strapped his swords back to his waist and stood up, stretching cramped muscles for a few seconds, his eyes focused on the bow of the ship. He dropped off the top of the galley and onto the main deck with a little grunt, the noise causing Usopp to turn his head from his fishing spot at the railing. The long-nosed sniper watched as the swordsman began to cautiously make his way towards the front of the ship, an unsure expression on his face as he muttered nonsense under his breath. The sniper wasn't as upset with Zoro as Nami was, understanding at least partially where the other team had been coming from. It was difficult when you felt like you were backed into a corner. It caused you to say things without thinking about them, and though he had only known his crewmates for a few days, Usopp had already figured out that Zoro did not have a way with words even at the best of times. He was curious as to what the swordsman would say to get back on Luffy's good side, half of him wondering if they were about to hear some kind of love confession. Nami poked her head out of the kitchen curiously. She had heard Zoro's footsteps above her head and assumed that the swordsman was finally going to bite the bullet. Thankfully, she had just finished making lunch and was able to watch as Zoro approached Luffy cautiously, with nothing to distract her. It's about time, she thought, slightly annoyed at the green-haired teen. Honestly, how long did it take to come to the conclusion that yes, you were in love with a scatterbrained idiot and had been for a while? Nami had noticed Zoro's possessiveness way back when she first met him. The way that his thoughts had been on Luffy's well-being when she was in the cage, or the hatred that came to his face when that weird unicycle guy tried to fight her. Obviously, he had been half in love with her even back then. That it took him this long to figure it out himself, and he had help no less, was almost pathetic in her book. Sometimes Zoro could just be so slow. The Oranget leaned against the open galley door and just watched as Zoro scratched the back of his neck nervously. Nami wondered what the man was going to say to Luffy. It better be something amazing because it had taken him 3.5 hours to come up with it. Zoro cleared his throat as he rested his arms against the ship's railing next to the figurehead, attempting to look semi-relaxed. From the corner of his eye he saw Luffy unconsciously flinch away from him, and it hurt that she was wary of him because he would never do anything to hurt her. But you already did hurt her, he thought to himself sadly. Shoving those thoughts away, Zoro clasped his hands together and took a deep breath. Luffy? He asked cautiously. When he heard no reply from the she-pirate, he looked away from the ocean to turn fully towards the raven-haired girl and found her watching him, not looking at him completely but trying to look without being noticed. Her gaze was curious but still slightly worried, and she was biting her lower lip so hard that Zoro was surprised that it wasn't bleeding yet. Her muscles were tense as if she was waiting for him to start yelling at her again, but she refused to let fear show on her face. She was a pirate captain, damn it, and would not look weak in front of Zoro of all people. Zoro just nodded at her and let a faint smile come to his face, attempting to reassure the girl somewhat as he knew what was running through her head. Lou, I'm sorry. He let out another sigh, something he seemed to be doing a lot of lately, as he tried to figure out exactly what to say to the young girl. After a few seconds of silence and internal debate, he decided to go with the truth, or as much of it as he was willing to share. I didn't mean to yell at you this morning, Lou. I was just angry, but not at you, he hurriedly added, seeing Luffy frown slightly at his words. He scratched the back of his head and let out an exasperated huff. Geez. I mean, I was lying when I said those things about staying away and such, I just... Zoro was cut off when two slim hands grabbed onto the front of his shirt, startling him somewhat. His eyes widened as he stared at the hands before following the stretched arms to see Luffy turning to fully face him. With a twitch of her lips, the raven-haired girl let herself be pulled from her spot on Mary's figurehead and towards Zoro. The swordsman let out a grunt as Luffy slammed into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck as her momentum caused them to tumble to the ground. He winced when his back hit the wooden deck, the air being forced from his lungs with a wheeze. It took a few seconds for his breath to come back, but when it did, Zoro forced himself up so that he was resting back against his elbows, one eyebrow raised in confusion as he watched Luffy settle herself in his lap. The she-pirate eyed her swordsman carefully for a second, both of them silent as they stared, before a smile lit Luffy's face and the she-pirate giggled softly, reassured by the look in Zoro's eyes. "It's okay, Zoro." Luffy shook her head slightly, her grin softening slightly as she broke eye contact. "You don't need to apologize, I know. I'm sorry too." Zoro sat up fully, a slightly annoyed sigh leaving him as he maneuvered Luffy until she was resting more comfortably in his lap, shaking his head at the girl's words. Seriously, he was trying to apologize and she just forgives him like that and even apologizes herself. He was going to need to have words with her later about being so forgiving and trusting. There was only so far she could go before it just became ridiculous. Zoro opened his mouth to respond to her but stopped, the words catching in his throat when he stared down at the Straw Hat Girl, watching her fidget slightly in his lap. She looked almost nervous, but Zoro quickly brushed that thought off. Luffy was never nervous, it just wasn't a part of who she was. She refused to make eye contact with him for a few seconds, biting her lip and glancing out at the ocean before she eventually sighed and looked back at her first mate. "Hey Zoro," she began, watching him curiously, her words almost hesitant. "You said you lied, so you don't hate me, right? You won't leave?" Luffy's voice grew in volume as she continued, growing more confident as she talked, her eyes darting across his face as if she was trying to see the answer to her questions in his gaze. "Please don't leave, Zoro. I promise I won't bug you as much, but I might forget and then I'll apologize, so." Zoro chuckled slightly, ruffling Luffy's untidy hair playfully before pulling the rambling girl into a tight hug, cutting off her rambling. "I apologized, didn't I?" he asked, grinning slightly, happy that Luffy seemed to be back to her old self. It had been too quiet these past few hours in his opinion, something he would have never thought that he'd say just a few weeks ago. But now, it just didn't feel right to Zoro if he couldn't hear Luffy humming or laughing or even just talking to herself. The she-pirate was brightness and noise and life. Besides, Zoro continued, his grin turning teasing as I thought the queen of the pirates needed the best on her crew. It wouldn't be complete if you didn't have the world's greatest swordsman, right?" Luffy pulled back from the hug with the brightest grin that Zoro had ever seen on her face. She was nodding her head vigorously in agreement. "Yeah," she cheered, laughing happily before pulling the green-haired swordsman back in for a hug. Zoro breathed a slight sigh of relief as Luffy began to giggle again. He really hated himself for taking this happiness away from her for even a second, and even though he knew he would probably argue with her again, he would do his damnedest not to make her sad. His face began to flush slightly, his ears even turning red, as Luffy started to nuzzle against his collarbone happily and he groaned in resignation. He was set in his resolve to not tell Luffy that he loved her, but because of that it looked like he would have to get used to little displays of affection like this from her. Zoro couldn't help but be a little pleased that she didn't seem to be this affectionate with anyone else, even though she was very prone to hugging everyone. As that thought passed his mind, he suddenly remembered the other two people on the ship and his eyes moved from the raven-haired girl in his lap to look at the relieved expression on Usopp's face from where the sniper sat on the main deck railing and then to the Nami's smug grin as the navigator watched the two from her place at the galley door. Her grin widened when he made eye contact with her and Zoro just glared at the Oranget before retuning his gaze to Luffy. The girl was still latched onto him and he poked her side in an effort to get her attention. "Oi, Lu, can you get off me now?" Lunch had passed uneventfully now that Luffy and Zoro were on better terms. Usopp swore up and down that the fact that Zoro wasn't actively frowning constituted a smile. In fact, in Zoro expressions it was practically a wide grin. Nami had cracked up at the glare that Zoro had sent Usopp and the fact that when Luffy called his name shortly after his whole body seemed to perk up. Honestly, he was being a little obvious. After lunch had been finished and the dishes had been done, everyone had split up to enjoy their free time. Nami was making a new map of Syrup Island in the surrounding sea and Usopp was at the bow of the ship doodling on a piece of black fabric. Luffy had commissioned the sniper to try and make a flag for them since they were now an official crew. In her mind, 4 people was enough to warrant a pirate mark and matching flag. Zoro was in the middle of the main deck swinging around a 5-ton metal hammer in some weird sort of training exercise. When asked where he had gotten the enormous weights, Zoro had mumbled something about Kaya asking what he wanted on the ship. Luffy just sat on the stairs to the front of the ship, her elbows resting against her knees and her head pillowed in her hands as she watched Zoro train. There was nothing really for her to do on the ship, having been banned from making the flag after her disastrous first attempt, and so she was currently amusing herself by counting her first mate's swings for him. 2,345. 2,346. 2,347. I finished it. The shout came from behind Luffy and the girl whipped her head around so that she could watch as Usopp set down his paintbrush, an excited grin coming to her face. Let me see, Usopp. The sniper scrambled to his feet and gave the raven-haired girl a thumbs up and a proud smile, puffing his chest out as he began to gloat. Behold the wonderful masterpiece that I, Captain Usopp, have made. You have never seen anything as awesome as. Quit bragging and let's see it, Zoro said, dropping his weights lightly to the ground and rolling his shoulders gratefully. The green-haired teen made his way to the stairs, stepping into place just behind Luffy so he could see over her head. Even Nami had stopped her work to watch, a little curious herself. Usopp just smirked and shook his head at Zoro, as if he was pitying the older man, before he turned and revealed the newly designed pirate flag. Behold! My legendary piece of pirate art, truly a masterpiece. Luffy's eyes swept the black piece of cloth, a frown beginning to form on her face as she took in the image. The pirate flag that Usopp had designed had a skull that looked a lot like the long-nosed teen. It was grinning and facing slightly to the side, a green bandana on its head and curly black hair. One long bone was crossed in one direction and in the other was Usopp's green slingshot. Who told you to make your own flag? Both Luffy and Zoro yelled, the green-haired teen moving to hit Usopp upside the head and the girl reaching forward and pinching his cheek between her fingers. Ow! Geez, Lego! Zoro took a few steps back to get another look at the mark and hissed slightly in exasperation. A pirate's flag is a symbol of death and terror. That is not even the least bit frightening. Luffy's mark was scarier than that, Zoro stated, crossing his arms as he leaned back against the railing. Yeah, hers was terrifying cause of her horrible art skills, Nami added with a chuckle. The Straw Hat Girl glared at Nami before poking Zoro's side hard in retaliation. Ow! No appreciation for talent, Usopp sighed dramatically. I'll have you know that I have been painting for 50 years. That would make you an old man, silly. Luffy giggled, having caught Usopp's lie this time and feeling a little proud of herself. The sniper just sighed dramatically. Fine, but what are we going to do about our flag? Any bright ideas? We need a mark that strikes fear into the heart of pirates and marines alike. Something scary yet easy to remember, Nami muttered, tapping her chin as she started to think. The others nodded, agreeing with her assessment and all falling silent as they tried to think of something. Why don't we do something similar to Luffy's first idea? Zoro finally muttered, glancing up at Usopp. A pirate skull, crossed bones, and her trademark scar. He poked at said scar as he said it and Luffy smacked his hand away, protesting slightly. Don't forget my hat. Less than 10 minutes later, the flag was finally done. Usopp looked down at his work proudly, a few splotches of yellow paint stuck to his cheek and a satisfied smile on his face. Just like they had decided, he had created a somewhat old-fashioned Jolly Roger with 2 crossed bones behind the skull. The skull was smiling and Luffy's scar was present under its left eye, the girl's bright yellow straw hat completing the image. This is awesome, Usopp, Luffy cheered, clapping her hands together happily, her eyes sparkling. I have to admit, it's not bad, Nami agreed with a nod. Yep, this is our mark for sure, said Usopp, proud of his skills. Nami turned to Zoro and her small smile turned into a smirk. Wow, Zoro. I guess I was wrong about you. It appears you do have a few brain cells left. I guess you're not famous enough to have lost them all yet. Zoro growled at her in warning, about to snap back at the navigator but was interrupted when Luffy jumped onto his back, wrapping her legs around his waist and draping her arms over his shoulders. Nay, Zoro. Our flag looks so cool, now we're officially pirates. The swordsman turned his head to look at his captain and smirked slightly. I thought it was official when I joined your crew. That's what you said in Shell's town, right? Luffy paused, mouth open, having been in the middle of chanting, "Pirates," over and over again. She tilted her head to the side as if she was thinking, a wrinkle coming to her forehead. Well, yeah, she agreed, pouting. But now we're officially pirates. Zoro just chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief before turning back to their other two crewmates. Nami grinned, slightly relieved to see that the captain and first mate were truly back to how they used to be. It was nice to see their banter and teasing again, but Nami could see the slight change in Zoro's eyes. The way that he watched Luffy longer than he used to, the joy when she laughed and the hints of love buried in his gaze. She sighed slightly and shook her head. She had hit the nail on the head before, it seemed. Somehow, Nami had known that when Zoro figured out his feelings that he would bury them. Now she would just have to wait and see if Luffy ever noticed the signs. She would probably have to help the girl along a little bit, but what were friends for? The blackmail material she would get from their relationship having no factor in her willingness to help, obviously. Painted on the sail, Usopp, Luffy ordered, sliding off of Zoro's back and running over to tug on the sniper's arm in an attempt to convince him. Okay. Usopp had made another flag to hang above the back sail before moving on to paint the large cream-colored main sail. Now that he was done, the Going Merry was finally complete and looked like a true pirate ship, albeit a small one. Now that they were done, each returned to their own work. Usopp had collapsed next to the mast, exhausted after painting the sail, and Nami returned to her maps. Zoro had also returned to his training, leaving Luffy alone and bored, which was never a good combination. Seeing the cannon on the back of the ship, the girl quickly darted up the steps and past the galley to the aft deck. It's too quiet. Where is Luffy? Usopp cracked one eye open and scanned the main deck, a little worried when he couldn't spot the raven-haired girl. That is never a good sign. A loud crash followed by a joyful giggle echoed from the back of the ship, and Usopp was suddenly wide awake, eyes focused firmly on the trail of smoke coming from the direction of the noise. He wasn't the only one startled either. Zoro had stopped mid-swing and turned towards the noise. "Luffy, what are you doing?" Nami shouted, storming up the steps, angry at having her concentration broken. "I found a cannon," came the she-pirate's happy voice, and Luffy stepped into sight of the others, her face completely covered with black soot and a bright grin on her face. "I can't quite get it to work though." Usopp bit his lip to stop from laughing at the ridiculous look on the so-called pirate queen's face and, exhaustion forgotten, he scrambled to his feet and started to make his way towards Luffy. "Well, of course you can't," the sniper scoffed, shaking his head before pointing to himself. "Only the great Captain Usopp can man the complicated machines aboard a ship. Just watch and learn, Luffy." Luffy nodded eagerly, excited to see what Usopp could do with a cannon considering his skills with a slingshot, and she moved to follow the long-nosed teen to the back of the ship when a hand latched firmly onto the back of her vest. "Oh no you don't. Go wash your face in the kitchen. You look filthy, Luffy." Nami sighed, shaking her head as she pushed the raven-haired girl towards the galley door, unable to believe the younger girl's simplicity. But really, she should have been used to it by now. Luffy grumbled slightly but followed her navigator's order at the stern look in the Orangette's eyes, sticking out her tongue at the other girl when she was sure Nami's back was turned. From the kitchen, she could hear Usopp mumbling to himself and the loud boom of the cannon, and she tried to peek through one of the portholes in an attempt to see what the boy was doing. "Woohoo, bullseye, I am the great Captain Usopp." Luffy giggled at the pride and excitement in her crewmate's voice, quickly drying her face and stepping out of the galley, wanting to give the cannon another shot. She was walking along the upper deck, watching Zoro train as she passed him when something white caught her gaze. Leaning against the side of the main deck, next to the stairs, were Zoro's 3 swords, but Luffy's gaze was stuck on the white one that clearly stood out next to the 2 plain black swords. Quietly, trying not to get noticed by Zoro, who seemed completely focused on his reps, Luffy snuck down the stairs and sat down on the bottom step next to the swords. She carefully reached over and picked up the white one, holding it delicately in her hands. The sheath itself was beautiful, and Luffy could see the care that had gone into making sure it stayed in almost perfect condition. It was definitely in better shape than the other 2. One hand settled against the hilt, feeling the worn leather and metal under her fingers, and she moved to slowly draw the sword when a hand clamped over hers, preventing her from moving and holding her firmly. Luffy winced and glanced up at Zoro, wondering if the swordsman was mad at her again, but only saw a thoughtful and almost sad look on his face. "You need to be careful, Luffy," he said quietly. "Swords are not toys." "I know that." The raven-haired girl pouted cutely at the reprimand, causing Zoro to chuckle slightly. He removed his hand from hers but didn't take the sword away from Luffy, which surprised the girl. Instead, he took a seat next to her, sighing slightly as he caught his breath from the rough workout. Luffy watched him curiously for a few seconds before turning her gaze back to the sword in her hands, absently stroking the sheath with her thumb as she began to speak. "You really like this sword, huh?" Zoro turned his head to her, watching how carefully she held Wado. "I can tell. It's the same with my hat. You love this sword, it's your treasure." Her eyes found Zoro again and Luffy smiled happily, removing one hand from Wado to pat the hat on her head for emphasis. Zoro's gaze dropped to the sword, Kuina's sword, and he sighed. "This sword, it's called the Wado Ichimonji. It's not mine, but it is a treasure. It's—" His words trailed off and he squeezed his eyes shut as memories began to assault him, things that he tried to bury in the past, that he didn't want to think about now. His face twisted in pain and Luffy felt her chest clench slightly, a frown coming to her face as one hand moved to rest against her heart. She didn't like seeing Zoro upset. It made her feel sick, and she could almost sense the distress coming from her swordsman. Wanting to comfort him, but not quite sure how, Luffy reached out with the hand not holding Wado and brushed her fingertips lightly against Zoro's cheek and jaw before moving to clutch one of his hands and giving it a reassuring squeeze. Zoro flinched slightly at the soft touch, the brush of fingertips against his cheek pulling him from his memories, and he blinked his eyes open, staring down at the small hand that was resting on top of his own calloused one. "Zoro." His eyes darted to Luffy at the sound of his name and the girl squeezed his hand again before continuing, the words coming to her easier now that Zoro's steel-colored eyes were focused on her. Luffy knew that she normally wasn't that good at thinking things through. She preferred just to charge headfirst into everything. It was who she was, and so she just let herself ramble, hoping that her words would help erase the sad look from her swordsman's face. "I'm sorry. Whatever happened to you back then, whatever made this sword so important to you, I know it was sad and I'm sorry that you had to go through that." The girl took a deep breath and nodded, more to herself than to him. She was doing better than she thought she would and she quickly continued, the passion in her voice clear. "But Zoro, I know it's painful to talk about the past, but I'm here. I want to know more about Zoro and no matter what, I won't ever leave, promise." When Luffy finished she smiled, the happiest and most loving smile that she had ever given Zoro. It was the kind that made his heart pound against his chest, the one that always left him feeling warm and calm. He lost himself in Luffy's dark brown eyes, letting all the thoughts wash from his mind. Looking at Luffy, he felt no pain when the memories of Kuina came, and it was at that moment that he thought that it would be okay to tell his tiny captain about the promise he had made to his childhood rival. Zoro smiled softly back at Luffy and ruffled the girl's untidy black hair gently, making up his mind. Promiting back at her, his own heart feeling lighter when her eyes flashed with joy, letting her warmth and happiness wash away his sadness as he began to speak. "That sword. It belonged to a childhood friend of mine. Her name was Kuina." He slowly began to talk, his words quiet at first but growing stronger the more that he spoke. He told her how he had left his home and challenged the nearby dojo. How he could beat every adult swordsman with ease but was never able to land even a hit on the daughter of the dojo master, on Kuina. Zoro explained the rivalry that they had, the friendship that formed from it, and his desire to one day become stronger than her. His voice broke slightly when he told Luffy of his last duel with Kuina before her death. She had tripped down the stairs. It was a death that she would have been ashamed of, he joked, his lips twitching into a fond smile. Finally, he spoke of the promise that they had made before Kuina's death, that one of them would become the world's greatest swordsman. When she died, Zoro swore that he would become the best and fulfill not only his dream, but hers as well. "Sensei, that katana, please give it to me. I will take her share of training and become even stronger. I'll become so strong that my name will reach the heavens. I'll become the strongest swordsman in the world, we promised." Zoro remembered begging his master for Kuina's prized katana. It was the last time he had cried, the tears flowing freely down his cheeks when Koshiro had agreed and handed the white blade carefully to Zoro. Kuina's soul and dreams, I leave them to you. Luffy's eyes were back on the white sword in her lap as Zoro finished his story, feeling the sword almost seeming to hum under her fingers. It was as if she could feel it, the dreams of the young girl who had died and left Zoro alone in the world, the hopes and prayers she wished that she could say. That's why I must become stronger, why I will not stop until I am the greatest swordsman in the world. It was our promise to each other and I will make Kuina's and my dream come to life. Zoro fell silent, watching Luffy as the girl stared down at the sword, at his treasure, with a soft look in her eyes. His own eyes dropped to the Wado Ichimonji, his chest feeling a bit lighter now that he had finally told Luffy his story. The raven-haired girl stayed silent for a bit, just taking in everything that Zoro had told her, feeling the emotion that had been behind every word and the feelings that she could feel echoing from the sword, before a small smile came to her face. Then I know yours and Kuina's dream will come true, she said, eyes finding Zoro's and her smile growing bigger with every word that she spoke. It'll come true because I know that Zoro will be the best and strongest swordsman ever. Her eyes sparkled with happiness, taking in the shocked and slightly pleased expression on her swordsman's face. Her hands clenched against Wado's hilt as she looked up and watched the clouds that passed above them. I know that Kuina knows it too. I can feel it in Wado. Her faith in you and her dreams. Luffy's face softened when she spoke the other girl's name, feeling a kinship with the girl that had inspired Zoro so long ago. I promise I'll take care of him from now on. Luffy swore, eyes twinkling when she felt the sword hum in her hands. She eventually looked away from the bright blue sky and found Zoro staring at her, a small half-smile on his face. They were both content to stay like that, watching each other silently and enjoying the peaceful moment when a loud noise suddenly echoed from the other side of the main deck. Both jumped slightly and turned to look as a figure leapt over the railing and onto the deck, kicking over and shattering a few empty barrels as he did. Pirates, come out and fight me, the bounty hunting duo of East Blue. It had been calm, something that was rare for the newly created Straw Hat Pirates, a peaceful mid-afternoon on the clear waters of the East Blue. The only noise that could be heard was the occasional sound of cannon fire as Usopp attempted to get used to the new weapons on their ship and the soft scratching of a pen against parchment as Nami took notes for her sea chart. For once, Luffy was quiet, relaxing on the steps to the main deck as she took her time examining the white sword in her hands. Zoro's story was racing through her mind and her heart swelled with happiness at the knowledge that Zoro trusted her enough to talk about his past. Not only that, but he was letting her hold his sword, the Wado Ichimonji. Luffy knew it was his most prized possession, as important as her hat was, and the fact that he hadn't immediately grabbed it from her when she touched it was making the raven-haired girl feel a little giddy. Zoro sat next to her on the stairs, content with just watching his captain as she began to hum, enjoying the comfortable warmth that spread through him just from being in her presence. Just like always, however, the peace didn't last for very long. A loud crash broke the stillness of the afternoon. A lone man jumping over the railing and onto the main deck opposite of Luffy and Zoro. As soon as his feet touched wood he was moving, kicking over a few barrels as he passed them, screaming at the top of his lungs. Come on out you pirates, I'm gonna slaughter all of you. Luffy jumped slightly in surprise, the loud shout pulling her from her thoughts, and she rose to her feet quickly, excitement flashing in her eyes. She carefully handed Zoro back his sword, patting the sheath one last time as a sort of reassurance to herself before moving to stand in front of the intruder, her arms crossed over her chest. The man's shouts stopped when Luffy neared him and she took that opportunity to size him up. He was taller than her, but then again, most people were, and he had short black hair. His eyes were hidden by a pair of dark sunglasses and there was a large black kanji tattoo on his left cheek that meant, "See." He wore a short-sleeved purple shirt with a blue zip-up hoodie over top and Luffy watched calmly as he readied his weapon. A sword with a red handle and a circular guard. The blade of the sword got broader the further away it was from the hilt and the she-pirate determined that it was obviously too large for a sheath. Who the hell are you? Luffy asked, tilting her head curiously, not appearing to be the least bit intimidated. Who am I? I should be asking you that. The man was beyond furious, not even seeing the person in front of him. Only an opponent to be destroyed. He charged Luffy with a yell, forcing the girl to jump backwards to avoid his swing, and she pouted as the intruder's swing slammed into Mary's main mast. I've killed countless numbers of infamous pirates, and yet, how dare you, some no-name little pirate brat, try to kill my partner. Hey, Luffy could see that the man was mad at her, for what she didn't know, but that didn't excuse his callous treatment of her ship. Don't you damage Mary. She dodged another swing from the mystery man, and her frown deepened as he sliced through part of the upper-level railing. That's enough. Luffy stretched her arm out, her fingers latching onto the front of the man's hoodie, and, in a move reminiscent of what she had used on Captain Kuro, she yanked him towards her and flipped the angry man over her shoulder. He slammed head first into the wooden deck, body crumpling instantly as he was knocked unconscious. Luffy just let out a little sigh, dusting her hands together and smirking slightly. What the heck was that? She muttered, placing a hand on her hat and just staring down at the man in front of her. Zoro carefully set Wado next to his other two swords and stood up before making his way towards Luffy and their mysterious intruder, a little curious himself. His eyes did a quick sweep of his captain, relaxing when he saw her giddy expression before he turned to the newcomer, his eyes widening in shock. "Is that Johnny?" he asked, surprised. Even upside down he recognized the tattoo immediately. It had been a while since he last saw either of the bounty hunting duo, and speaking of, Zoro glanced around the ship, a little surprised to not see Johnny's partner in crime as he moved to stand next to Luffy. "Hey Usopp, get some water," Luffy ordered, turning away from the unconscious man to look over at the corner of the galley where Usopp had been carefully watching the scene unfolding on the main deck, making sure his body was mostly out of sight. When the sniper gave her a look of disbelief and just continued to stare, she smiled and gave him a thumbs up. "Zoro knows him, it's okay." The long-nosed teen scrambled away as Luffy turned to look over at Zoro, grinning at her swordsman. She was excited to meet someone from Zoro's past, and from the way her first mate had said his name, this Johnny guy was a friend. Maybe he's a bounty hunter like Zoro was? He didn't seem to like pirates too much. The she-pirate knelt down next to Johnny and began to poke lightly at his cheek, entertaining herself with her attempts to wake him up. The sunglasses guy finally began to stir, returning to consciousness at the sound of voices and the soft pressure of something pressing against his cheek. He blinked a couple of times in confusion before focusing in on the person leaning over him. She was one of the prettiest girls that he had ever seen, and his eyes widened slightly when she smiled and turned to look at someone that he couldn't see. Her skin was lightly tanned, as if she had spent a lifetime in the sun, and her short black hair whipped around her face as the wind swept past them. "Hey Luffy. I think he's awake." Johnny could tell that the speaker was obviously male and the voice sounded familiar to him, but he just watched quietly as the girl, Luffy, turned back to smile down at him, her chocolate brown eyes sparkling. "Yeah?" she asked, grinning happily. "Hey Johnny. You awake?" Johnny started slightly when she returned to poking his cheek, in shock that the teenage girl had known his name. A shadow fell across him as another person leaned over to get a good look at him, this one standing so he was blocking out the sun, and Johnny immediately recognized the familiar green hair and annoyed scowl. "Be big bro Zoro." Johnny quickly sat up and flipped over so that he could look at the swordsman properly, his mouth dropping in shock. "Is that you?" His eyes swept the other man, taking in the familiar white shirt, green haramaki, and black pants. The black bandana wrapped around the man's left bicep was just the final piece that proved that the person standing in front of him really was Roronoa Zoro. "You're on a pirate ship, big bro? Why?" From the corner of his eye he noticed the girl, Luffy, stand up and watched as she danced over to Zoro's side, giggling. Johnny's eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw Zoro's stance relax slightly when the girl neared, his eyes softening when she smiled up at him. "So you do know him? I said that earlier, didn't I?" Johnny just shook his head and jumped to his feet, arms spread wide as he gestured to the ship around him. What's going on here? He was hyperventilating a little, confused and overwhelmed by everything that had happened recently. "Hey, calm down. Where's Yosaku? Isn't he with you?" Zoro asked, his expression slightly concerned. As soon as the name passed Zoro's lips, Johnny's entire demeanor changed, his expression morphing into one of sadness. It's, Yosaku is here but he's just come take a look, big bro. Johnny gestured for Zoro to follow him and the green-haired teen nodded before he and Luffy walked over to the side of the ship that Johnny had come from and followed the man's gaze down to a small dingy bobbing next to the Going Merry. Yosaku lay on the main deck, spread out on top of a blue blanket. He wore a black shirt and yellow-green coat over top and a pair of black boots. His head was shaved and he had on a red piece of sparring headgear. A white bandage was wrapped tightly around his stomach, the white cloth slowly turning red as blood leaked from a wound they couldn't see. He was far too pale and that worried Zoro slightly. Yosaku is. Tears began to pour down Johnny's cheeks and Zoro patted his shoulder in a comforting manner as Luffy lifted herself onto the railing, intending to pull the sick man up so they could get a better look at him. "Lu, be careful," Zoro insisted, watching his captain worriedly, knowing what she planned to do. If she lost her footing she would end up in the ocean and he would have to get her. Not that he minded saving his captain, it was just… His mind flashed back to the last time Luffy has fallen off the boat and the soft kiss she had given him for saving her. Zoro quickly shook his head, dispelling those thoughts. As he worked to fight off the blush he could feel rising to his cheeks. Not the time, he chastised himself, watching as Luffy stretched her arms down and carefully grabbed onto the edges of the blanket. Her position gave him a great view of her ass and the swordsman tensed slightly as he realized that he wasn't the only one watching her. His eyes slid to the side and narrowed as Johnny swept his eyes up and down Luffy's frame. He knew that the bounty hunter was insanely worried about his partner and he sympathized, but that didn't mean that Johnny had free rein to look at his captain. Zoro stepped closer to Luffy, obscuring Johnny's view as the raven-haired girl began to pull back and reel in the sick man. From the position he was in, Zoro was able to steady Luffy as she began to wobble from the extra weight, and when Yosaku was close enough, he grabbed the blanket and helped Luffy to bring him over the railing and onto the main deck of the Going Merry. As soon as Luffy released her hold on the blanket, Johnny was pushing past her, quickly dropping to his knees next to his partner. "What happened to him?" Zoro asked, even more concerned now that Yosaku was close up and he was able to truly see just how sick he was. "He was perfectly fine until a few days ago. Then he started getting pale and he keeps fainting or getting really dizzy. I have no clue why." Johnny ran a hand through his hair agitatedly, his eyes filled with pain, not even noticing as the rest of the Straw Hat crew began to gather around. Usopp grimaced in sympathy, his expression of worry mirrored on Zoro's face. Luffy knelt on the other side, a contemplative look on her face. She couldn't help but think that she had seen this before, years ago when she was still back in Fuchsia. Some fishermen had come back to the village after being stuck drifting for weeks out at sea and they looked a lot like Yosaku did. One of them had died but she remembered Makino saying that the other one would be okay. When she had asked Ben about it the next time he and Shanks returned, the first mate had told her that it could happen to people who didn't get enough food to eat or something like that. She frowned slightly and crossed her arms over her chest. She couldn't remember what it was though. That stuff was always boring so she never much paid attention to it. Shanks' stories were much better. Lately, his teeth started falling out, and his old wounds have started to bleed again. He's just gotten worse and worse and I just don't know what to do anymore. Nami made her way quietly down the stairs at the bow of the ship, her hands on her hips and a skeptical look on her face as she listened to Johnny talk. It was pretty obvious already what was going on with Yosaku, but it seemed that none of the boys had clued in. Her eyes flicked over to Luffy, noting the confused and almost thoughtful look on the raven-haired girl's face. Looks like Luffy might actually have an idea of what's wrong with this guy. I guess she's not a complete space cadet after all. Nami smirked softly as Johnny continued to speak. I found a rocky island and thought I could let him rest quietly for a bit, but there was a loud noise and then your ship attacked us. Johnny's voice broke at the end and he dropped his head into one of his hands, tears cascading down his cheeks. Usopp's jaw dropped and he stared down at Johnny in shock from his place standing behind Luffy. His eyes were as wide as saucers as he remembered that he had been the one to launch the cannonball at the rocky outcropping. He had just been trying to practice his shooting and impress the other members of the crew, and now an innocent man would die because of him. I am sorry, he stuttered, bowing apologetically to Johnny. Luffy just continued to pout slightly, her head tilted to the side and confusion in her eyes. Usopp. I don't think. Sorry isn't good enough, Johnny snapped, cutting Luffy off as he removed his hand from his face and slammed his closed fist into the deck next to him. If all problems could be solved with an apology, we wouldn't need the police. Usopp cringed slightly, guilt written all over his face, and Luffy's thoughtful expression turned into a glare. Don't you yell at him, she snapped back, but Johnny just ignored her, his eyes and mind focused completely on his longtime partner and best friend. Yosaku was panting hard, seeming even worse than ever, and Johnny sniffled pitifully, tears still streaming freely down his face. Big bro, is he? Do you think he's going to die? Johnny hesitated, stumbling over the words, afraid that with just one sentence he could lose Yosaku forever. Zoro didn't have the heart to say anything. It'd be too much for Johnny if he admitted that he thought Yosaku was going to die. Nami just rolled her eyes and let out a soft snort, which only Luffy seemed to hear. The female pirate captain turned her head to stare at the navigator, taking in the exasperated expression on the other girl's face. They won't listen to anything, Nami, the girl said, sighing. Do you know what's wrong with him? And they say women are overly emotional. Nami just muttered, shaking her head as she knelt down at Yosaku's head so she could get a closer look at the sick man. She carefully lifted one eyelid before opening Yosaku's mouth and pulling out his tongue, humming slightly when her suspicions were confirmed. What are you? What the hell are you doing to my partner? Johnny shouted, yanking Nami's hand and pulling her forward so he could yell more in her face, forcing her to lean slightly over Yosaku. Nami, have you completely lost it? Zoro added, glaring at the orangeette. Nami just rolled her eyes and used her free hand to shove Johnny back away from her. You guys are real idiots. What did you say? Zoro growled. He took a step towards Nami but froze when a hand planted itself firmly on his chest. He recognized the feel of the small hand, and his suspicions were confirmed when he glanced down to see that Luffy had stretched her arm forward and was holding him back. She was watching Johnny with a slightly annoyed expression on her face, and her gaze flickered over to Zoro for a second, her eyes silently asking him to trust her. Of course, Captain. You don't even need to ask. He didn't say anything out loud but tried to convey that message with a small nod of his head and watched as Luffy relaxed, a happy smile coming to her face. Now, will you all shut up and let Nami work? She ordered, turning away from Zoro to look back at the dark-haired bounty hunter. And you, don't yell at Usopp. Stretching out her other hand, she pinched Johnny hard on the cheek. Nami chuckled slightly, having caught Zoro and Luffy's silent communication. They never ceased to surprise her with their uncanny ability to understand each other, and she shook her head slightly. A smirk came to her lips as she took in Luffy's exasperated look, which was focused solely on Johnny, also noting the almost amused expression on Zoro's face from the corner of her eye. Finally remembering where she was, Nami turned her head and looked back down at Yosaku. Uso's in storage, bring them here now, she ordered after another quick check of the sick man. Usopp quickly scrambled back and made his way to the storage room, wanting to be of some use because he still felt as if all of this was his fault. Once Usopp retrieved the barrel full of limes, Nami told him to start squeezing the juice into Yosaku's mouth. Luffy moved to sit across from Usopp and grabbed a few limes herself, helping the long-nosed teen with his work as Nami turned to the other two men and began to explain what was going on. He got scurvy, she sighed, leaning back against the railing and crossing her arms over her chest. Scurvy? Johnny just looked at the orange-haired girl blankly, as if he didn't understand. We got to him in time, he should recover in a few days. The orange-haired girl gave a slight nod, as if she was agreeing with her own words, and Johnny's confused expression melted into one of happiness. Hey, are you sure, big sis? Oh, thank you, I'm really grateful for big sis. Grinning brightly, Johnny opened his arms and tried to pull Nami into a hug, but the navigator just scowled slightly and forcefully pushed his face away from her. Just, don't call me that, idiot, and stop spaying your words all over me. Luffy set down the limes that she had just finished squeezing into Yosaku's mouth and stood up, dusting her hands together, in an unconscious gesture that said, I'm done. She moved to Usopp and patted his head reassuringly, smiling down at the still worried teen before walking past him and towards where the others were standing. She stepped forward and pinched Zoro's cheek before turning and pinching Johnny's as well, causing the bounty hunter to stare at her in shock. That's for yelling at Usopp, she explained, staring pointedly at Johnny. "Why did you pinch me too?" Zoro yelled, rubbing his cheek with 2 fingers in an attempt to soothe the sting. Eyes narrowed slightly at the raven-haired girl. Luffy turned to Zoro and blinked a few times before grinning sheepishly. I dunno. I just kinda felt like it." She giggled at Zoro's exasperated expression, rubbing the back of her head sheepishly. "Does she do that often?" Johnny asked, glancing over at the green-haired swordsman. Before Zoro could reply, a loud shout from Usopp had them all looking down at where Yosaku was slowly starting to regain consciousness. Luffy bounded over to Usopp's side and leaned over the sniper's shoulder, watching Yosaku curiously. The bounty hunter groaned as he let his eyes crack open, hearing the voices of people around him. The first thing he saw was a long-nosed teenage boy with black curly hair staring down at him with a relieved expression on his face. He blinked a few times, silently wondering if he had met the teenager before when his gaze was drawn to something over the long-nosed teen's shoulder. A pretty girl was standing behind the curly-haired boy, her chocolate brown eyes watching him curiously. When she noticed that he was looking at her, she smiled brightly and started to giggle. Her short black hair emphasized her heart-shaped face, and even though she was small, Yosaku could definitely see that the girl had curves. "I've got to be in heaven or something. I wonder if she's single." "Yosaku." Yosaku turned his head at the sound of his voice being called, seeing the relieved face of his longtime partner, Johnny, staring down at him. With a cheerful laugh of excitement, Yosaku sprang to his feet and, grabbing Johnny's arm, began to dance around the deck. Both men were singing happily as they spun about while the others just watched in disbelief. "You don't recover that quickly," Nami shrieked, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Zoro just watched the two with an unsurprised expression on his face, his gaze drifting over to Luffy, who was holding her stomach and laughing. The corners of his mouth twitched, a small grin coming to his own face as he watched her laugh, the sound infectious and rendering him unable to fight the warmth seeping through him. He turned away when Luffy's eyes slid to his and forced himself to stop smiling, not wanting to be caught with anything other than his normal scowl on his face. "Don't need them thinking I'm soft or anything. I'd never hear the end of it from that witch." Luffy had seen it though, and it made her smile widen even more, her cheeks starting to hurt from the intensity of it. After another few seconds of dancing, the two bounty hunters stopped and faced the Straw Hat crew, semi-serious expressions on their faces. "Pardon us for not introducing ourselves," they chorused. "My name's Johnny." The black-haired bounty hunter stood tall with his feet shoulder-width apart and his right arm wrapped around his middle. The other arm was resting against it with his left fist braced against his tattooed cheek. "And I'm Yosaku," the formerly sick man concluded, striking a pose similar to his partner. His arms were switched, however, and he had his right hand resting against his chin, a cigarette held loosely between his fingers. And together were the most badass pirate bounty hunting duo in the world. They finished their introduction with a flourish, both grinning happily. "Big bro Zoro used to be one of us too. It's a pleasure to meet you all," concluded Johnny. Zoro just crossed his arms over his chest and smirked, shaking his head slightly. "What a small world, I never expected to see you guys here," he stated, shifting his weight to his other leg as he watched the bounty hunters calmly. "We're even more surprised," Yosaku laughed. "We never would have thought that pirate hunter Zoro would become a pirate himself." "What happened after you left us, big bro? What made you change jobs?" Johnny asked, watching Zoro curiously. A giggle drew the bounty hunter's attention and both turned to look at the small raven-haired girl standing to Zoro's right, the she-pirate giving them a bright smile when she saw them look at her. She stretched out her arm and latched herself onto Zoro's back, ignoring the shocked looks she received from the two bounty hunters. They had not expected that the small girl would be a devil fruit user, and they watched silently as she began poking Zoro lightly on the cheek. "Zoro should smile more," she muttered quietly, only loud enough for the swordsman to hear, and he just grumbled something unintelligible at her, flapping his hand at the one poking his cheek in an effort to get her to stop. "I saved Zoro from being executed, so he joined my crew," Luffy finally said, turning to the others and smiling happily before starting to hum softly. She had stopped poking Zoro and her arms were instead wrapped around her swordsman's neck, legs hanging free. She started kicking them out behind her leisurely as Johnny and Yosaku stared at her, surprised and more than a little confused by her words. Zoro's eyebrow twitched in slight annoyance. Oi. Saved? You blackmailed me, you little brat. Though his expression was angry, there was no heat in his words, and as Zoro turned his head to get a glimpse of Luffy, his expression softened. He reached a hand back and ruffled her hair, getting a giggle from the raven-haired girl which caused a grin to appear on the swordsman's own face. He always enjoyed their banter and teasing and let his awareness shrink until he was focused completely on the raven-haired girl latched to his back. Luffy tugged lightly at the earrings in Zoro's left ear, trying to rile her swordsman up again. Zoro's been sleeping a lot since we left Syrup Village, she began, letting the words trail off. PSH, how would you know? Zoro snorted. You've had Usopp to entertain you. Not that he had been jealous or anything. It had given him more time to relax, and he had actually gotten a few chances to get relaxed since she was otherwise occupied and not bugging him every 15 minutes. He just wasn't able to fall asleep cause the sun was in his eyes, and he had to keep an eye on Luffy in case she fell off the ship. Yeah, but he's not Zoro. The swordsman could hear the pout in Luffy's voice with a look at her, and a silent laugh rumbled through his chest. Luffy just narrowed her eyes and puffed out her cheeks in annoyance before continuing. Plus, Zoro was being stupid earlier, so you have to play a game with me. Captain's orders, she nodded decisively, satisfied with her impromptu decision. Captains. Zoro choked slightly. Lu, I will toss you overboard. Luffy just rolled her eyes and gave a sigh that sounded like she was annoyed with having to explain something that should be obvious. But then Zoro will get wet too, stupid. Johnny and Yosaku just watched the interaction between the two with wide eyes, having never seen their big brother look at anyone like that. And the way he was talking with her and letting her hang off of him was just as shocking. Back when they traveled together, he would have thrown and then beaten anyone who was dumb enough to even get near him. But big bro Zoro appeared completely calm with the she-pirate latched to his back, and the look in his eyes was one they had only seen directed at his prized sword before. The bounty hunting duo glanced at each other, trying to figure out if they were really seeing this or if they were both just hallucinating or something. Your crew? Johnny finally asked, remembering the raven-haired girl's earlier words. Luffy turned her attention back to the bounty hunting duo and nodded happily, letting herself slide off of Zoro's back before moving to stand in front of the swordsman. Yup. My name is Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm going to be the first ever queen of the pirates. Her smile was the brightest that either Johnny or Yosaku had seen, and they watched, shocked, as Zoro placed one hand reassuringly on Luffy's shoulder, the other settling almost unconsciously against her opposite hip. Zoro's my first mate. He's gonna be the world's greatest swordsman. The bounty hunters knew of Zoro's dream already, but the way that the swordsman's smirk had widened at her words made glance at each other again. Both seemed to come to the same conclusion, and they nodded at each other before turning back and pointing between the two. So you're his. So she's your. Johnny and Yosaku began to talk at the same time but froze when Zoro frowned, pushing Luffy behind him and storming up to the brothers. Don't finish that thought. He growled angrily, a dark glare on his face, but his eyes flashed with something that looked almost like worry. Johnny blinked a few times before he began to wave his hands back and forth in a placating manner. While he didn't quite understand what the heck was going on, he knew better than to provoke Zoro, and the green-haired swordsman already looked like he was kind of on edge. He and Yosaku really needed to get Big Bro alone and get some answers out of him later. For now, all they could do was apologize and let the matter drop. Sorry Big Bro, we didn't know. Yosaku began, having been thinking the same thing as Johnny. We didn't say anything about your captain being cute or anything like that. Zoro's glare deepened and Johnny winced slightly. He hadn't meant for that to slip out, but seriously, the girl, Luffy, was really hot and he would have to be blind not to notice. He noticed Zoro's teeth grind together and made another mental note to himself. Okay, don't mention Luffy around Big Bro. I wonder if the other girl is free? It's okay Big Bro. She's yours. We get it, Yosaku added, trying to placate the swordsman, coming to the obvious conclusion that Zoro had some sort of claim on the raven-haired girl. If anything though, his words only seemed to darken Zoro's mood even further. He grabbed the two bounty hunters' shirts and yanked them close before hissing quietly, his eyes darting back and forth between them. Quiet, you two. Luffy is my captain, nothing else. You got that? I don't want to hear another word about it. But big bro. The way you act with her, there is nothing between us. Zoro felt his chest throb slightly in pain as he said that. Luffy was his captain and that was all she would ever be. Even though he knew he loved her, she was too naive and innocent to develop feelings like what he had for her. Zoro was fine with that. He was fine with watching her from his place as her first mate, protecting her, and being there when she needed him. He sighed slightly and let Johnny and Yosaku go, shaking his head sadly. Just don't say anything. His tone was practically pleading and both Johnny and Yosaku caught the desperation in his words. Grinning, in an effort to lighten the mood, Johnny clapped Zoro on the shoulder. Course, big bro. Whatever you say. In his mind though, he was still curious as to what big bro Zoro's relationship with the she-pirate was. He would just have to keep an eye on them. Yosaku moved to do the same thing but his hand slid right over Zoro's shoulder as he lost his balance and fell forward onto the deck, unconscious. He still was nowhere near close to being alright, and the bit of excitement he had experienced with Zoro's growling and grabbing had not helped. Nami informed them that he would still need more time to recover. After they carried Yosaku down into the men's quarters and left him to rest on one of the spare hammocks, the crew gathered in the galley. They were sitting quietly, Luffy, Usopp, and Johnny all drinking cups of tea while Zoro downed his trademark sake. After a few moments of peace Nami finally spoke. Let this be lesson to all of you, she began, sighing softly. Yeah, this is the kind of trouble you run into while sailing on the sea, Zoro agreed, setting down his empty cup. Usopp frowned thoughtfully before adding his own input. Which means while we're at sea, we need to consider how we're going to get the right amount of nutrients with just the small amount of food we'll be able to carry. When we think about it carefully, knowing how to manage our rations is a necessary ability. Everyone fell silent at Nami's words, contemplating what their next move would be. A necessary ability, huh? Luffy repeated, crossing her arms over her chest and tilting her head to the side as she thought. After a few seconds a grin came to her face and she chuckled. Of course, we just need to add a cook to our crew, simple. What? They all turned to look at Luffy, slightly shocked by her simple, yet extremely intelligent idea. The she-pirate just giggled happily and clapped her hands together. Let's go find us a cook then. For once Luffy, you're spot on, Nami praised, smiling slightly. Sometimes Nami forgot that the happy-go-lucky girl was actually a lot wiser than she acted and it showed in her occasional comments and observations. Usopp was beaming and even Zoro had a small smirk on his face, a slightly proud look in his eyes. If you guys are looking for a cook then I know just the place, Johnny said, bringing their attention back to him. It's not too far from here and the food is amazing. Even Johnny was excited. He was happy that he had found a way to slightly repay the Straw Hat crew for helping him and Yosaku. Really, thanks Johnny? Luffy cheered, diving to the side to give the bounty hunter sitting next to her a quick hug. Johnny pulled back first, feeling a dark stare digging into his back and turned to catch Zoro in his gaze. He watched as his friend's glare slid off of him after a second before it moved on to Luffy, the glare quickly softening. Ah, I see how it is. Johnny fought back the urge to grin. He never would have thought he would see the day when serious, angry, big bro Zoro fell in love with someone. He couldn't wait to tell Yosaku about this. Disguising his chuckle as a cough, Johnny quickly continued with his explanation. We need to be careful though. This place is close to the Grand Line and is frequented by lots of strong people. The dark-haired bounty hunter stood up and made his way over to where Zoro was leaning against the wall and smirked. I've heard a lot of rumors about the place lately. There was one that caught my interest, one that said that a certain hawk-eyed individual that you'd be here. Zoro started slightly, his whole body tensing as a manic smirk spread across his face. His hand went to the white katana strapped to his waist and he gripped it tightly, his thumb slowly stroking the sheath. Johnny smirked as well and turned to Nami, pointing his finger out at some unseen location in the distance. Set our course for north-northeast. Our destination is the sea restaurant Barati, enter Sanji. The restaurant was nothing like what any of them imagined it would be. It looked almost like a ship in the shape of a fish but at the same time it was a large 3-story building. The fish head and tail were as tall as the first floor and 2 large main sails jutted up from it. In the center was a smaller second and third floor, making the entire building look like a giant three-tiered cake. Our destination, the floating restaurant, Barati. Johnny swept his arm out to encompass the entire restaurant floating directly in front of them, grinning as he watched the wide-eyed expression that crossed the faces of the raven-haired girl and the long-nosed teen. Even the orange-haired navigator looked slightly impressed, but Zoro just shook his head, appearing unimpressed with the building. "It's kinda tacky, actually," he thought, scratching at his hair distractedly. "What do you guys think?" the bounty hunter asked, crossing his arms over his chest and raising one eyebrow curiously. "It's a giant fish," Luffy cheered, laughing and clapping her hands together excitedly. "That is so cool." "Isn't it amazing? It's very impressive," Nami acquiesced, not wanting to appear excited, but you could see the curious glint in her eyes. "This is the most awesome place ever," Usopp stated, pumping a fist in the air. Behind them, Yosuke had finally awoken and was slowly making his way up the ladder and onto the main deck, wondering what all the shouting was about. When he saw his partner gesturing towards the large restaurant, he began to drool, looking forward to getting some decent food in his stomach. He let the hatch drop closed behind him and made his way up towards the front deck, giving Zoro a reassuring nod when the swordsman looked at him curiously. Yosaku's eyes slid to the right and he froze when another ship entered his field of vision. He would recognize that blue and white paint anywhere, and he paled. What? Why is there a marine ship way out here?" Luffy turned, tilting her head curiously as she caught sight of the ship as well. It wasn't a warship. In fact, it looked to be no bigger than the Going Merry, and they could see no soldiers on deck. "It didn't come all this way just to attack us, did it, Luffy?" Usopp asked, starting to look a little worried. "I have a feeling this is going to be trouble," Zoro bit out, the hand he had rested against the railing curling into a fist. "Shit. I shouldn't have left my swords in the galley." His frown deepened and he unconsciously scooted a little closer to his captain. Just out of the blue, Nami crossed her arms over her chest, not missing the way Zoro moved to cover Luffy, and she sighed. Behind her, Johnny nudged Yosaku and both began to quietly sneak back towards the storage room, hoping that they wouldn't be noticed by whatever marine soldiers were on the small ship. They made it to the door right as a marine emerged on deck and began to scan the ship. "I've never seen your pirate mark before," the marine commented absently. He wore a white pinstripe suit with black buttons and a blue shirt underneath. His hair was a pale shade of pink, much lighter than Kobe's pink hair, and a large scar started under his right eye and moved vertically down towards his jaw. He had one hand in his pocket and placed the other lightly on the railing of the marine ship, appearing unconcerned with the sight of the pirate ship in front of him, and the Straw Hats could see that he had a pair of brass knuckles with screws at the end on his hand. "I'm the Marine Lieutenant, Iron Fist Full Body," he called, lifting his hand from the railing and curling it into a fist in front of him. "Hey, who's your captain? Show yourself and state your name." Luffy stepped forward calmly, resting all her weight on one foot and popping out her hip so she could rest one hand on it. "I'm the captain, my name is—" She was interrupted when Usopp stormed forward and struck a pose, practically shouting at the marine ship. "I'm Captain Usopp, the brave warrior of the sea. My name strikes fear into the hearts of all men just from the mere mention of—" Luffy smacked the long-nosed teen upside the head, one eyebrow twitching in annoyance. "I told you, Usopp," she hissed, pinching his cheek. "I'm the captain and you're the sniper, now hush." Sighing, she turned back to the marine, leaving Usopp to rub at his stinging cheek. "As I was saying, my name is Monkey D. Luffy and I'm the captain of this ship. Our pirate mark was just made yesterday." Usopp scooted a bit away from Luffy in an attempt to avoid the pinch he knew was coming and pointed at his chest. "I was the one who made the pirate mark." Luffy turned and pouted at the curly-haired teen. "Usopp," she whined. Before she could stretch out to pinch him again, a large fist collided with the back of his head and he turned to stare up at Zoro, who was giving him a pointed look. "Cut it out," he muttered, watching as Usopp rubbed at the bump on his head in annoyance. "Is that so?" Full Body smirked, giving Luffy a very obvious once-over, his eyes sliding up and down her body. When he had first asked who the captain was, he hadn't expected a girl. Most of the pirates that he had dealt with were middle-aged men. The occasional female captain that he ran into mostly looked like that Alvida. He shivered slightly in remembrance of the last time that he had run into the female pirate. This girl though, she was cute. More than cute, she was hot. He took a moment to appreciate how her button-up tank fit her, emphasizing her slim waist and generous chest, before his eyes slid down to her long, tan legs and the gracious length of her denim shorts. Now this was a pirate that he wouldn't mind chasing after. Zoro growled loudly, his steel-colored eyes almost black with rage and his hand clenching at the railing so tightly that it cracked under the pressure. The look on the Marine's face easily betrayed what the pink-haired man was thinking, and Zoro felt the urge to grab Luffy and shove the small girl behind him. I need to keep her locked up in the men's cabin or get her some sort of large, baggy shirt that says, "Back the fuck off," on it. This is ridiculous, he thought, sick of all of the men that had been eyeing Luffy lately. Nami heard Zoro's growl but didn't bother to turn her head to look at the swordsman that she knew was giving off an aura of death. Usopp, though, had turned at the noise and his eyes widened when he took in the look on pure fury on the green-haired swordsman's face. He began to carefully take a few steps to the side as Zoro continued to growl, not wanting to be anywhere within the line of fire. Lieutenant Full Body though, either didn't sense the aura of malice directed at him or didn't care, because after a few more seconds of ogling Luffy he began to sweep the rest of the ship with his eyes. "I've seen those two before," he muttered, eyes narrowing as his gaze slid to where Johnny and Yosaku were hiding behind the open storage door. "I thought you guys claimed to be pirate hunters?" he scoffed, smirking at them. "Congrats, it looks like you finally caught yourselves some." His words were condescending and Johnny pushed himself out from behind the door, both bounty hunters gritting their teeth in anger at his words. "What did you say?" Yosaku hissed, joining his partner on deck. "This is too good." Full Body began to chuckle softly as a young woman stepped up next to him. She was very pretty, with long and wavy blonde hair pulled up in a clip and brown eyes. She wore a floor-length, maroon-colored sleeveless dress, and the Straw Hats watched quietly as she placed a hand on Full Body's arm and drew the man's attention away from them. Zoro had to fight back the urge to smirk when he saw the woman. With a lady like that Marine would have no choice but to stay away from his captain. The woman would keep him in his place and Zoro wouldn't be forced to kill him for looking at Luffy. Still, Zoro stepped forward a bit more until he was standing just behind Luffy. "No harm in being careful. We're going to be late for our reservation," the woman purred, sweeping a loose strand of hair over one ear and pushing out her chest slightly so that her cleavage was more visible. "Of course." "Hold on," Johnny protested, digging through a pocket on the inside of his jacket. "Do you think small-time bounty hunters would go after guys like these?" Appearing to have finally found what he was looking for, Johnny pulled his hand out of his jacket, clutching a stack of papers in his fist. He threw the stack at the Marine lieutenant, who had begun to walk away, scattering dozens of wanted posters across the deck of the Going Merry. Nami glanced down at them and one caught her eye. "Arlong. Wanted dead or alive. 20 million. Her eyes narrowed slightly and a flash of anger crossed her face, but no one took notice because Full Body was glancing their way again. His eyes swept over Luffy again, the Marine also taking notice of Nami standing only a few feet away from the raven-haired girl before he turned to look at his date. "Moody, darling. Why don't you head back inside for a bit and have another glass of wine while I deal with these pirates?" "Are you sure, dear? What if they try to hurt you?" Moody glared at the men on the Going Merry as if they were the bad guys before letting Full Body take her hand and give her a reassuring kiss on the cheek. "I'm not a Marine lieutenant for nothing, Moody. Everything will be fine." After giving her hand a gentle squeeze, he lightly pushed her towards the door. Once the woman was out of sight, Full Body straightened his suit and turned back to the Going Merry, grinning at Luffy and Nami. "I apologize for my earlier behavior, ladies," he purred, giving Nami and Luffy a shallow bow and attempting to smile charmingly. Nami wrinkled her nose slightly, a frown coming to her face at the look that the Marine was giving her. It was a look she had been given by many men, and yet it still gave her goosebumps every time. "I had no idea that two such beautiful ladies existed in this world. Your beauty is wasted on a pirate ship such as this." Full Body turned his gaze to Luffy, who was watching him with an almost confused expression on her face, and grinned. "So, little angel, how about you ditch that tiny piece of driftwood and I'll show you how good a ride on a real ship is." He put special emphasis on the words ride and ship, his smile turning somewhat lecherous as he leered at the raven-haired girl. Usopp winced slightly at Full Body's words, disgusted by how forward the Marine was being and also a little worried about what he knew was coming. His eyes slid to Nami, who had dropped her head into one hand and was shaking it in disbelief. Usopp just sighed, counting down silently in his head and looking back at the Marine with a pitying expression. 3, 2, 1. Zoro snarled, the sound loud in the sudden silence that Full Body's words had caused. The Marine's eyes flicked up to the green-haired man standing behind the she-pirate, the look on the swordsman's face one of pure fury. Neither Usopp nor Nami moved an inch at the sound, having been expecting it the moment Full Body finished talking, but the bounty hunting duo had not expected the angry sound. They jumped slightly in shock, turning their heads to glance at Zoro with matching expressions of disbelief. They had never seen Big Bro Zoro this angry before, and they glanced at each other before a small smirk came to Johnny's face. Luffy turned her head as well, her brow furrowing. That was Zoro. Why would he? Is he okay? Her heart rate had sped up at the sound and she placed one hand against her chest, her frown deepening. My heart is pounding. I'm not getting sick like Yosaku, am I? Zo. She opened her mouth to ask her first mate if he was okay when two large arms suddenly wrapped around her shoulders and pulled her back. She felt Zoro squeeze her against his chest for a second before her swordsman was suddenly pushing her behind him. You. He snarled, glaring darkly at the Marine lieutenant in front of him. I am going to rip him to pieces. How dare he talk to Luffy like that? I am sick of these guys hitting on my captain. Before he could say anything else, Luffy latched onto his back, wrapping her legs around his waist and draping one arm across his neck before she pointed at the Marine from her makeshift perch. She could still feel the phantom sensation of Zoro's arms on her and it bothered her slightly. She had never had anything like that happen to her before, not even with Ace and Sabo. So why did it happen with her first mate? I'll ask Nami about it later, she thought, shrugging it off. She didn't have time to think on it right now. Right now, she had words for the pink-haired Marine weirdo and she wasn't going to sit quietly while he talked bad about her ship. First though, she had a question. Hey, what do you mean small? Isn't your ship the same size as ours? Are you a moron? Luffy appeared genuinely curious, the Marine's perverse intentions passing right over her head. Full Body appeared gobsmacked, not able to decide if the she-pirate was making fun of him or if she really hadn't caught the invitation in his words. Luffy didn't pause to give him time to answer though, she just continued to talk, a frown coming to her face as she remembered what else the man had said. He called Mary Driftwood, and don't insult Mary, stupid Marine, idiot, she added, sticking out her tongue at Full Body and using the hand not latched onto Zoro's neck to pull down one eyelid in a childish gesture. Full Body froze, having not expected such an outburst from the small she-pirate, and even her crewmates seemed somewhat surprised. Zoro was standing, partially crouched and ready to attack, an almost confused expression on his face as if he wasn't sure what to do after Luffy's words. A small snort of amusement from Usopp broke him out of his stupor and Nami quickly joined in, both of them giggling at the matching look of shock on Full Body's face. Really though, Nami had seen this coming. Being around Luffy as long as she had, she knew how the girl was likely to react to a Marine hitting on her. The orange-haired girl rolled her eyes. I wonder if Big, Bad Zoro is going to start acting like this with every guy that hits on Luffy. I think that the male population of East Blue is going to get a lot smaller if this keeps up. A small smile came to her face. It does make good blackmail material though. Zoro let out a soft, almost self-deprecating chuckle, his captain's words finally sinking in. Luffy never failed to amaze him with her naivety and childishness. It really did work in his favor though. It meant that anybody that tried to get with his captain would have a hell of a time. It would also give him enough time to show them that his captain was off limits. Sighing, Zoro brought one hand up to rub at the almost permanent crease in his forehead, the other moving to poke Luffy in the side and forcing a squeak of surprise from the she-pirate, a sort of childish revenge for all of the emotional ups and downs he had been going through lately. You're going to be the death of me, Captain, he muttered quietly, not really realizing that he had said the words out loud until Luffy began to giggle and pull lightly at the earrings in his left ear. Why was Zoro growling? Zoro scared me. Are you angry? What happened? I'm hungry. Should we get food? Is that why you're angry? I'd be angry without food too. Can we go to the restaurant now? Luffy continued to babble, still hanging off of Zoro and causing the swordsman to laugh, both of them completely ignoring full body and causing the pink-haired man to grow angrier and angrier as time went by. She had rejected him. Not only that, but she had called him a moron. Him, Marine Lieutenant, Iron Fist, full body. No one insulted him. No one. On top of that, she was ignoring him for some crappy, wannabe bounty hunter. Sink it, he yelled to a soldier standing watch nearby. Sink that crappy pirate ship to the bottom of the sea. With one last glare directed at Luffy and her, turned and stormed back towards the door, intending to collect his date and get some food. Johnny and Yosaku were fuming, sparks almost shooting from their eyes as they glared daggers at the retreating Marine Lieutenant. He simply ignored us, Johnny hissed, throwing his arms forward in a loose gesture towards the Marine ship. We'll get him back later, Yosaku muttered, clapping his partner on the back. His eyes, however, weren't focused on the Marine ship but rather the green-haired former bounty hunter at the bow of the Going Merry. He hadn't been around when Johnny had come to his conclusion about the relationship between Big Bro Zoro and the small she pirate, but his partner had told him about it later that evening while they were resting. At first, he hadn't believed Johnny, but now. Damn, he wasn't kidding. Big Bro Zoro really is acting like he's in love with Luffy. He bit back a chuckle at that thought. Yosaku had thought that Zoro would be the last of them to fall in love, if he ever did. The green-haired swordsman was so focused on his goal he never noticed anything else, much to the constant amusement of Johnny and him. Seems I owe Johnny an apology. Nami, not really worried about what the Marines intended to do, calmly made her way over to the scattered pile of wanted posters in front of Johnny and Yosaku. Luffy and Zoro could probably handle whatever the Marines threw at them anyway. What's all this? She asked, kneeling down to get a better look at the scraps of paper. Those are all people with bounties on their heads, big sis Nami. Johnny answered, glancing down at the navigator. He quickly clapped a hand over his mouth, remembering just as the words left him that the orange-haired girl hated being called big sis. He held his breath for a few seconds, waiting for her to start yelling at him, but when Nami didn't look up from the wanted poster she had picked up, he continued to talk. It means that if we get him, we'd get the money offered on their wanted poster. It's a good way to earn a living, isn't it, big sis? Yosaku added, throwing his arm around Johnny's shoulder and grinning, both of them looking pleased with their chosen line of work. Johnny slapped a hand over Yosaku's mouth. Don't call her big sis. He muttered quietly. She got mad last time I did it and she's scary. Nami just continued to stare at the poster in her hands, her shoulders beginning to shake and her eyes shadowed under her hair. Her fingers clutched tightly at the paper and she crumpled it slightly, holding it against her chest as she took a few deep breaths. The person on the poster was obviously someone very close to the navigator, but neither bounty hunter could figure out if the wanted pirate was a friend or an enemy. This is bad. They're aiming right at us. Usopp's shout drew everyone's attention back to the Marine ship, which was preparing to fire a cannonball straight at the main deck. Within seconds the shot was ready and the Marines quickly fired the cannon, the loud sound echoing around the two ships. Leave it to me, Luffy whooped, jumping off of Zoro's back and onto the ship's railing, wrapping her legs around one of the vertical posts. Gum gum. She grinned happily, stretching her arms out to the side and latching onto the main mast with one and Mary's figurehead with the other. Pachinko. The cannonball slammed into her stomach, her body barely missing Zoro as the swordsman stepped to the side and stretching her across the ship and over the other edge. Her hat slipped off her head from the momentum and Zoro quickly grabbed it so it wouldn't get blown away, his eyes wide as he watched Luffy stretch. Sometimes he forgot that Luffy's entire body was rubber and that she could take hits like this without even blinking an eye. As Luffy reached the peak of her stretch, the cannonball's momentum having been slowed down by her body, the hand on Mary's figurehead slipped, which caused her to twist slightly, changing the trajectory of her rebound. She shrieked as she shot forward, the cannonball leaving the makeshift sling she had created with her body and launching straight towards the restaurant while she slammed into the figurehead. The crew watched as the cannonball arched up and straight into the roof of the third floor, the loud crashing sound and subsequent black smoke causing them all to wince. Luffy slid back off of the wooden figurehead, wincing slightly when she dropped onto the deck, her hands moving to rub at her stomach soothingly. That had hurt a bit. "You okay, Captain?" Zoro asked, kneeling next to Luffy and placing her hat carefully back on her head, grinning when her hands shot up to grip at the brim. "Yeah," Luffy sighed, slowly rising to her feet and dusting herself off. "My hand slipped." A pout came to her face and Zoro chuckled slightly before flicking the girl's nose. "No worries, Lou, it was an accident. You protected Mary at least." Luffy grinned as she batted Zoro's hand away from her face, nodding her head after a few seconds. "Yeah. Stupid Marines." She turned to look at the restaurant, a thoughtful frown appearing on her face. "Still, I should go apologize." As soon as Luffy entered the restaurant, she was grabbed by two of the chefs and led upstairs, both of them muttering about how she had hit the head chef's room. They exited the main restaurant and led her up a flight of stairs in the back and around to the third-floor balcony. "Head Chef Zeph. We found the culprit," one of them shouted, pushing the wooden door open and shoving Luffy forward and into the bedroom. Her eyes quickly swept the room, finally settling on the middle-aged man sitting on the bed in front of her. He wore the standard white outfit of the cooks in the restaurant, brown pants, and a blue sash wrapped around his neck. Luffy's eyes traveled up to his face, taking in the blonde goatee and impressive mustache. It was braided and stuck straight out from his face, each side almost 12 inches in length. He had a large bulbous nose and small eyes, but what caught Luffy's attention was the growing patch of red underneath the cap of his very tall chef's hat. "I'm very sorry." Luffy bowed to the chef, a pout on her face. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, her hand had slipped, but still, it was her fault. As she stared at the ground, her eyes zeroed in on the wooden peg leg where the man's right foot should be. "Whoa! A peg leg!" she shrieked, her eyes widening with shock. She leaned closer, holding out a finger as if she was about to poke it. "I didn't do that, right?" "No, you stupid girl." Zeph swung the wooden peg at Luffy, forcing her to pull back her hand as the middle-aged man glared at her. "Well, that's good then." Luffy giggled happily, a small sigh of relief breaking free. "It's cool, old man. All you need is an eye patch now." Zeph's eyebrow twitched slightly, fighting back the urge to yell at the girl again, and instead directed his glare to the chefs who had brought her in, almost daring them to say anything. "This happened a long time ago," Zeph began, untucking his white cooking shirt and revealing the purple and orange striped undershirt beneath. "However, I'm still injured. Medical bills and repair charges for the ship are going to be expensive." He loosened the blue neckerchief as he continued to talk, watching Luffy calmly as the girl crossed her arms over her chest and settled all her weight onto one leg, his head tilted curiously. When he finished, Zeph leaned back against the headboard of the bed, letting out a small sigh of contentment. "I won't ask you to cut me any slack," Luffy finally said, straightening up and tipping her hat back. "But I'm kinda broke. I've got nothing." Zeph was a little surprised at the honesty and the sincere look in the girl's dark brown eyes, and he smirked. This girl might actually be a little more interesting than the normal pirates that came through here. "For a pirate, you're pretty honest, lass." "That's unfortunate." Zeph sat back up again, trapping the fingers of one hand against his thigh lightly. "If you've got no money, you pences off." "Okay. I can do that," Luffy said, grinning brightly. "I'll go easy on you since you're a girl, but you'll have to work here, unpaid, for 1 year." Luffy was nodding along with his words but froze after a second, sweat beginning to drip down her face. I couldn't have heard him right, she thought, hoping that was the case. "Wait a minute," she yelled, waving her hands in front of her. "Back up. 1 year? A whole year?" Outside the restaurant, the rest of the Straw Hats had decided to wait for Luffy on the ship. Johnny and Yosaku were fixing the railing that Johnny had cut through when he first got on the ship and listening to the others talk. "What is taking Luffy so long?" Zoro muttered, lying back against the railing on the bow of the ship, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on his knee. He had wanted to go with her, but his carefree captain had insisted that she would be okay by herself. He hated waiting like this though. It wasn't even her fault in the first place and she was taking the fucking blame for it. If he saw that asshole Fist guy again, he would knock him out. "I don't know," Nami sighed, sitting up near the figurehead with Usopp. Her eyes moved to look at the hole that the cannonball had made in the roof before they dropped back to the front door. "With that much damage, they'll probably make her work here for at least a month." Usopp shook his head, rubbing at his forehead with one hand. His words caused Zoro to growl slightly and the swordsman glared at the long-nosed teen in annoyance. Johnny finished hammering the last piece of the railing into position and nudged Yosaku before both made their way towards the rest of the group. Is Big Bro worried that someone might steal Big Sis Luffiko away? Johnny asked, grinning slightly and taking a seat on the opposite side of the bow from the glaring swordsman. Wah. Zoro sputtered, turning to look at a grinning Johnny, his eyes wide. Nami and Usopp burst out laughing, clutching their stomachs as they watched Zoro struggle to come up with some sort of response. Honestly, neither pirate was that surprised. Zoro was anything but subtle when it came to Luffy, and Nami wiped at one eye before nudging the long-nosed teen next to her. Oh Lord, Usopp. They've only been here for 2 days and they've figured it out. It's so sad, isn't it? Usopp agreed, giving Zoro a pitying look. Zoro turned to glare at both of them, his face a bright red, wishing once again that he had grabbed his swords from the bunk room. Shut up, both of you, he snarled, hands clenching into fists against the wooden floorboards. Yosaku slid closer to Usopp, a teasing grin on his face and his gaze trained on the fuming swordsman. The former bounty hunter looked close to snapping and Yosaku wondered how much more he could tease him before Zoro tried to strangle him. So, he began, eyes twinkling. You guys know more than us. You've been around them longer, so you have to have some stories. Has Big Sis Luffy figured it out yet? Come on, share the good stuff. Well, Usopp began, a glint coming to his eyes. I haven't been here as long as Nami, but there was this one time when a large black boot collided with Usopp's forehead and all eyes turned to stare at a panting Zoro. The green-haired swordsman was on his feet, arm outstretched from when he had thrown his shoe, a dark look in his eyes and his face a bright red. The color stretched across his cheeks and down his neck. Even the tips of his ears were red and his eyes darted between the 4 people across from him, his expression that of a cornered animal. Nami just rolled her eyes and glanced over at the 2 laughing bounty hunters. To answer your last question, surprisingly, Luffy hasn't figured it out yet. Though I have no idea how she could have missed something like that. She swept an arm in Zoro's general direction, indicating the swordsman's flustered frame. That girl though. Her face twisted into a mask of annoyance. Instead of telling the workers that it was the Marine's fault like she should have, she opens her big mouth and says that she's the one who hurled the cannonball at them. Usopp sat up, a red mark in the center of his forehead, and the sniper sighed before nodding in agreement. Luffy's too honest for her own good. Zoro let out a sigh as well, settling down somewhat and silently agreeing with them. This would have been prevented if she had just told them it was the Marines, which it was. But, he thought, a faint smile quirking his lips, she wouldn't be Luffy if she didn't act like this, so I guess I can't complain too much. Inside the restaurant, Iron Fist Full Body and his date Moody had been given a window table with a beautiful view of the ocean and were having the time of their lives. They had just received their first course, a delicious-looking clear broth and individual loaves of bread. A waiter slowly approached their table, dressed in an elegant black suit, gold buttons down the front, and a blue-striped dress shirt with a matching black tie. He had golden blonde hair parted on the right side so that it hung over the left part of his face, obscuring one eye. The one eye that was visible was a startling ocean blue color that rested beneath a thin eyebrow with an odd swirl at the end. He approached the table, a cigarette between his lips and a bottle of wine in his hands, and carefully began to pour both Moody and Full Body a glass of the pale pink wine. All around them, other diners of the restaurant were staring and whispering amongst themselves. Hey, isn't that guy over there Lieutenant Full Body? One man asked his date quietly. He's a lieutenant of the Marines. Oh, he's so handsome and noble, one woman squeezed. Both Full Body and Moody carefully lifted their glasses, clinking them together in a toast as Moody smiled at the man sitting across from her. You're amazing, she murmured. Everyone's looking at you. Not true, Full Body countered charmingly. They're all admiring your beauty. Both smiled as they brought the wine glasses to their lips, Full Body taking a long drink of the pink wine. His eyes widened slightly after a second and he pulled back to look at the now half-full glass in awe. This is exquisite, he praised, causing the blonde waiter to smile, his cigarette arching up at the movement of his lips. He opened his mouth to speak when Full Body raised a hand, indicating that he wanted silence, the Marine lieutenant still examining the wine curiously. The waiter's smile dropped slightly and he watched silently as Full Body began to speak. "Tea this taste," the pink-haired man muttered, bringing the glass up to his nose and taking a deep whiff of the wine, trying to identify the smell. "This fragrance." The customers all around him watched Full Body curiously, wondering where the Marine was going with his statements. "It's the fragrance of Mikkuyo City, in the north. A bit sour, a bit spicy, and plenty of body. This wine is Wurzburger Stein." He said it with such confidence and enthusiasm that the other patrons began to murmur amongst themselves, obviously impressed. The waiter slammed the half-full wine bottle on the table, his eyebrow twitching in slight annoyance. Full Body, though, didn't seem to catch the mood that the waiter had descended into and instead turned and fixed him with a too innocent look. "Tell me, waiter, am I right?" he asked, false curiosity dripping from his lips. "Sorry, but it's not, sir," the blonde man replied, lips twitching with concealed amusement. Calmly, he grabbed Full Body's wrist, causing the Marine to cringe, before placing a spoon carefully in his hand and wrapping the man's fingers around the silverware. "Your soup's getting cold," the waiter continued, letting Full Body's wrist drop from his grip. "Please enjoy it while it's still hot." With that, he turned and began to walk away from the table, leaving Full Body staring blankly after him, his hand still raised in the air. As he neared the center circular stairs, the blonde waiter turned back slightly. "By the way, I'm the assistant," then he continued walking, not sparing another glance back at the shocked Marine lieutenant. "All the waiters ran away after what happened yesterday." Moody laughed softly, stifling her giggles by taking another sip of her wine. However, she was unable to hide the quirk of her lips around the glass that showed that she found the whole situation amusing. Full Body had never felt so humiliated in his life. He let the arm holding the spoon drop and gritted his teeth. He could hear the snickers and mutterings of the people around him, and it was infuriating. "Don't laugh at him," but the look on his face. After another few seconds of silence, Moody cleared her throat, holding the half-full glass of wine in front of her and staring at it curiously. "Do you know a lot about wine?" she asked, the words almost joking, as if attempting to lighten the mood. However, the words just embarrassed him even more, and he glanced up at the woman sitting across from him, forcing his expression into one of calm indifference. "A little," he muttered, lips twitching into a forced smile. "But it seems my sense of taste isn't working today." "Hey, what the hell's going on here?" Full Body's mind was racing and his face was hot with anger. His teeth ground together as humiliation burned in his chest. "I'm certain that I told the owner that I wanted a specific wine to be served when I made the reservation." Full Body had concocted this scheme in an effort to impress his date with his knowledge and class, but the plan had backfired. His eyes slid to the blonde waiter currently climbing the center staircase and his gaze narrowed. Full Body would make sure that the waiter who had made a fool out of him would pay. He wouldn't allow this humiliation to pass unchecked. On the third floor, Luffy moved to stand in front of the head chef, one hand on her hip and the other held in front of her, index finger raised. "What is that supposed to mean?" Zeph scoffed, raising one eyebrow at the determined look on the she-pirate's face. "1 week, Luffy said, voice strong, leaving no room for argument. "I can only work for 1 week." "What did you say?" Zeph was almost amused by the raven-haired girl in front of him. She was very honest and forward, at least. It was a refreshing change from many of the people he dealt with. Luffy sighed in annoyance, a pout coming to her face before she lifted another finger. "Fine then, 2 weeks. Hey now, you ruined the restaurant and seriously injured the head chef," Zeph countered, exasperated. He leaned his head forward, smacking Luffy on the head with his tall chef's hat. "Do you think you can make up for that in just 2 weeks? 1 or 2 weeks of unpaid work won't cut it." Luffy tilted her head to the side, a thoughtful expression crossing her face before she smiled. "Then how about 3 weeks?" "Hell no. Didn't you hear a word I just said? Was this girl serious?" Zeph couldn't believe how simple she was. Couldn't she get it through her head that no matter how many fingers she added, he wouldn't accept anything less than a year? "No." Luffy's voice was quiet, but the single word echoed through the room. It pulled Zeph from his thoughts, and he watched the girl closely as she removed the worn straw hat from her head and stared down at it. "I don't think you understand. I've been waiting for 10 years to become a pirate. I can't afford to waste another year stuck in this restaurant." Her eyes were shadowed, but a small smile came to her face as she stared down at the hat before she looked up at the head chef. "Yosh, I've made up my mind." She crossed her arms over her chest and fixed Zeph with a serious look. "I'll work here for 1 week to earn your forgiveness and that's it. No more." Zeph smirked softly. "This girl. I haven't seen conviction like this in years. She may just turn out to be something else." "Are you really in that much of a hurry?" Zeph asked, standing up from his spot on the bed and making his way towards the raven-haired girl, his smirk melting into a serious expression. "Then allow me to offer you an alternative solution." Zeph kicked his peg leg out, slapping one of Luffy's shins roughly and causing the girl to flinch slightly. "Instead of a year, you can give me one of your legs instead." "No way." Luffy scoffed, waving a hand dismissively in front of her face. "Are you insane? I need both of my legs, old man." Stubborn brat. Full Body continued to stare at the clear broth in front of him, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the intense desire he felt to make the blonde waiter bastard pay. As he stared down at the soup, he noticed a small bug skittering on the floor around his feet. Seeing it gave Full Body a very wicked idea that he could use to disgrace that blonde moron and ruin the restaurant's reputation at the same time. As the bug skittered under the table, he stepped on it with his foot, the sound causing his date to glance up at him in confusion. He just smiled reassuringly until she returned to her food, and then he glanced down again, moving his foot to stare at the partially squished bug underneath before grinning. "Waiter, hey, waiter," he called, getting the attention of the assistant head chef that had been wandering around the dining area. At his yell, everyone stopped and turned to stare at the marine lieutenant. Even his date paused mid-spoonful and looked at Full Body curiously. On the other side of the restaurant, Sanji froze mid-step and turned towards the corner of the restaurant where Full Body sat with his date before making his way slowly over to them. "Didn't I tell you that I'm not a waiter?" he said coolly, tone slightly annoyed. He rested one arm against the table and glared over at Full Body before turning his gaze to Moody. "But you've certainly got good taste when it comes to your company." He flashed the blonde woman a charming smile, his tone suave before placing his hand delicately over hers. "How about it, miss? Would you care to ditch this guy and have some wine with me?" His voice and manners were far more charming than Full Body's had ever been, and Moody blushed slightly. She opened her mouth to reply when Full Body slammed his metal-plated fist onto the table, ruining the moment. "Hey," Full Body growled, pointing down at his bowl. "Does this restaurant serve bug soup to its customers?" "Bugs?" Sanji's gaze returned to Full Body and he glanced down at the soup, eyes zeroing in on the small bug floating in the center of the bowl. "Then what is this bug in my soup? That should do the trick," Full Body thought, grinning smugly. Sanji froze for a second before smirking softly. "I'm very sorry, sir, but I don't know either." Full Body glanced up at Sanji in shock, not expecting that reaction from the blonde man. "I'm not much of an expert on bugs," Sanji continued, still smirking, his cigarette hanging between his lips. "But it looks like it's doing the backstroke." His words were obviously meant to be teasing, and Full Body's eyes widened slightly as the people around him began to laugh, some of them muffling the sounds behind their hands. Even Moody was giggling, one hand pressed delicately against her mouth. Full Body's plan had backfired once again, but instead of feeling humiliated like he had last time, this time he was completely and utterly furious. His hand clenched into a fist against the table, his steel knuckles flashing, as if sensing the man's wrath. "Don't you dare mock me. Yeetir. Full Body stood up suddenly, bringing his clenched fist up and slamming it down into the table, breaking it completely in two. As the table broke, the plates, silverware, and food were all tossed into the air. The plates broke as they hit the ground and the silverware bounced, making a clanging sound as it landed. Food littered the floor, completely ruined and now inedible. The other customers of the restaurant were shocked to see the famous Lieutenant Full Body lose his temper, and they watched the scene unfold in front of them, slight fear and worry in their eyes. Moody had been forced to her feet with Full Body's attack the broken remains of the table slightly, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Sanji knelt down in front of the spilled broth, his fingers dancing lightly over the clear liquid and skirting the broken pieces of china. His expression was one of sadness and slight disgust, his eyes shadowed by his hair. "If you just picked the bug out, it would have been edible." He muttered quietly. I spent 3 full days and nights making this soup. Sanji's tone was full of anger and spite, but it was still quiet, as if he would start yelling if he spoke any louder. To make it worse, Full Body lifted one of his feet and slammed it down onto Sanji's hand, digging his heel on the man's knuckles and sneering down at the blonde cook. Should you have such an arrogant tone towards your customers? Sanji didn't reply and his expression never changed, his eyes still shadowed by his hair. I'm the customer, Full Body continued, voice raising into a shout. A customer who paid you money. Moody grabbed onto his arm, having finally regained her senses and wanting to stop the Marine's inflamed behavior. Stop it, Full Body San, she begged. Shut up, Full Body roughly yanked his arm out of her hold, an angry snarl on his face. His harsh movements caused Moody to stumble back and she tripped over her feet, landing hard on her butt. Full Body San, Moody's voice wavered slightly, confused and hurt by the Marine lieutenant's words. Can money truly satisfy your hunger? Sanji's voice was quiet, barely audible as he continued to stare down at the ground. What? Full Body asked, not sure if he had heard the blonde man correctly. I said. Sanji finally raised his head, his blue eyes fixing Full Body with a glare that was filled with more rage than the Marine had ever seen directed at him. Can money fill your stomach? Moving too fast for anyone to follow his movements, Sanji jumped back and then flipped himself forward onto his hands. He transitioned into a handstand and began to spin, his legs spreading out and slamming into Full Body with the force of a cannon. One foot slammed into his face, splitting his lip immediately and turning his cheek an ugly shade of reddish purple. The Marine lieutenant crashed to the ground, struggling to take a single breath, but he continued to glare at Sanji. With a snarl, Full Body forced himself to his feet and charged Sanji, bringing his steel fist back. He would wipe that smug smirk off of that blonde asshole's face. He was mere inches from Sanji when the cook's foot suddenly slammed into his chin, Sanji kicking his legs straight up until he appeared to be doing a standing split. Full Body's eyes rolled back into his head, blood dripping from his mouth, and appearing to be completely unconscious. He started to fall backwards but was stopped when Sanji grabbed the front of his uniform, yanking the Marine lieutenant forward and grabbing him by the neck before lifting him up until his feet couldn't touch the ground. This was the scene that awaited Zoro, Nami, and Usopp as they entered the Baratie. The customers were all in shock and even the cooks who had heard the noise and come to investigate were surprised. Sanji, one of them yelled, his tone frustrated. Assistant head chef. Zoro rested an arm on the katanas at his waist, scanning the silent dining room for signs of a yellow straw hat. When he determined that Luffy wasn't there, he returned his eyes to the blonde chef. Is this a fight or something? He muttered, the question intended for no one in particular. Blood continued to drip from Full Body's lips, mixing with the soup on the floor, and Sanji glared up at the half-awake man Darkle, his cigarette clutched tightly between his lips. Don't ever waste food around me again, he threatened, his tone harsh. At sea, if you ever provoke your cook, you're signing your own death warrant. Remember that well. His tone appeared calm but the words were filled with venom and Full Body gulped. Zoro, Nami, and Usopp were slightly impressed with the blonde cook. To have taken down a Marine lieutenant without sustaining a single injury was a remarkable feat. A shout drew everyone's attention to the back of the restaurant where a large, heavily muscled man stood, his eyes trained on the confrontation between Sanji and Full Body. The newcomer wore a dark blue chef's outfit with a white apron wrapped around his waist and a pink handkerchief around his neck. The man's head was shaved and he had triangle-shaped black stubble on his chin. Overall, he looked like a gangster or some sort of prison parolee, not the type of person that typically worked at a highly praised restaurant. Damn it, you're at it again, Sanji, he yelled, pointing at the blonde cook with an annoyed expression on his face. What are you doing to our customer? Isn't that guy a Marine lieutenant? Sanji glanced away from Lieutenant Full Body and fixed the man with an unimpressed look, not relinquishing his hold on the injured man. Got a problem, you crappy cook? What makes you think you can talk to me like that, Patty? A crappy cook like you has no right to call me crappy, Patty yelled back, slowly walking towards Sanji and grinding his teeth together. To a restaurant, customers are everything. Beating up our valuable customers, what are you thinking? He got right up in Sanji's face, but the blonde man didn't even bat an eye. He just turned his gaze back to the marine still held in his grasp and scoffed. Customer or not, it's no different. This guy not only ruined our dishes, he also insulted its chef. His jaw clenched and his glare deepened before he casually opened his hand and let full body drop to his knees on the ground. Sanji was so angry he didn't want to even touch the marine anymore and he grimaced in disgust. That's why I thought I should teach him a lesson. Zoro scoffed and leaned back against the open doorway, crossing his arms over his chest. What kind of restaurant is this? Do you treat all your customers this way? Full body panted, sitting back on his ass in an effort to catch his breath. How do you even stay in business? Neither Sanji nor Patty were paying any attention to Full Body's ramblings, both focused on staring the other person down, and the pink-haired man snarled before shouting, "I'll destroy it." His shout drew everyone's attention and they all turned to stare back at the gasping man. "I'll destroy your precious little restaurant. I'll take this entire place down. I'll contact my superiors right now." With every word Full Body spoke, Sanji's anger grew until he was seething, his face twisted into a look of pure fury. "I guess that means I can't let you leave this place alive," he snarled, walking purposefully towards the cowering Marine lieutenant. Before he could raise a leg to kick the man back down, his arms and chest were grabbed by the various chefs who had left the kitchen to see what all the commotion was about. "Stop it, assistant head chef. Let go of me," he started it. "Stop it, stop fighting, Sanji." Sanji continued to struggle, fighting to break free of the men holding him back from pounding on Full Body. To an outsider, it looked almost like a petty fight between kids, but the furious look on Sanji's face told otherwise. "Just who do you think you are, huh?" the blonde chef snarled, his expression promising swift retribution and a painful death if he managed to break free of the chefs holding him back. Full Body's expression was one of pure terror and he was scrambling internally, trying to think of a way out of this situation. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the opposite side of the restaurant and a large chunk of the ceiling broke free and crashed to the ground. The commotion caused everyone to freeze and turn their heads in the direction of the crash, some eyeing the new hole in the ceiling. A groan came from the rubble and many of the chefs let out cries of surprise when they saw that head chef Zeph had fallen down along with the collapsed ceiling. "Head chef Zeph!" one cook yelled, quickly getting over his surprise. What's going on?" "Damn it, Zeph grg" to rub at the forming bruise on the back of his head. "You brat! Look what you did!" The chef stared at him, wondering if the owner had hit his head harder than he thought when Zeph tilted his head back and glared up at the hole in the ceiling. "This is your fault." "Are you kidding?" a voice yelled, causing the onlookers to follow Zeph's gaze to the ceiling where Luffy knelt, staring down through the hole into the main dining room. "How is this my fault? You attacked me, you crazy old man." Her tone was exasperated and she was staring down at the head chef with a disbelieving expression on her face. One of the cooks holding Sanji back turned his head. "What are you doing, head chef? Leave her and help us stop Sanji, he's gone crazy again." Luffy scooted forward a bit farther, leaning down through the hole more so she could get a good look at the new speaker. What she didn't account for was that the ceiling was already unstable from the earlier break and a rather large crack had appeared underneath her. With another large crash, the flooring beneath the she-pirate crumbled and she pitched forward with a shriek. Zoro's gaze had been focused on Luffy from the moment he heard her yell at the middle-aged chef, glad that she seemed to have things mostly under control. Hopefully they would be able to get out of here soon. His eyes flicked over to the blonde chef. The others had called him Sanji and Full Body. "That guy deserves the ass-kicking he got. I'm only sorry that I wasn't the one who gave it to him," he thought, one hand moving to grip the hilt of Wado tightly. Suddenly, Luffy cried out and Zoro swung his gaze back to his captain, eyes widening when he saw her fall forward through the hole in the ceiling. Shoving past Usopp and Nami, the swordsman sprinted towards his captain, intending to catch her before she could hit the ground when a black blur shoved him out of the way. Zoro slid to a stop with a growl, eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Sanji cradling his captain in his arms. Jealousy surged through his veins and his teeth gritted together, steel eyes flashing dangerously. "That prissy blonde moron better set Luffy down before I cut his arms off," he snarled, but the only ones who seemed to hear it were Usopp and Nami. Both turned to each other with matching looks of exasperation and Usopp shook his head sadly before they turned back to watch the scene in front of them. Sanji slowly and carefully set Luffy on her feet, leaving one of his hands resting against her lower back. The raven-haired girl let out a sigh of relief, one hand moving to rest on top of her hat. Phew, that surprised me. She turned to her rescuer with a grin, noticing that it was the chef that the others had been holding back before. Thanks, it's Sanji, right? Luffy froze mid-sentence when Sanji took a hold of both of her hands before dropping to one knee in front of her. Luffy could swear that the blonde man had sparkles floating around his head as he stared up at her with stars in his eyes. Sanji's at it again, one cook muttered, shaking his head with a sigh. He always gets lovey-dovey when there's a pretty girl around, another scoffed with a small chuckle. At least he's not trying to pound that marine guy into a pulp anymore. Beautiful goddess, my angel of beauty. I humbly thank you for gracing the Bharati with your intoxicating presence. I have no words to describe my feelings. He pressed a soft kiss to the back of one hand and opened his mouth to continue talking when Luffy was suddenly yanked backwards out of Sanji's hold and thrown over a hard shoulder. Zoro just snarled down at the still kneeling Sanji, hefting Luffy into a more comfortable position. One of his hands gripped Watto's sheath until his knuckles turned white and he used his thumb to pop the blade up. Keep your hands off of my captain, Zoro hissed, watching carefully as the blonde man rose to his feet and took a lazy drag of his cigarette. She is my captain, my Luffy. Don't tell me what to do, asshole, Sanji snarled back. Full Body, having finally regained all of his senses, just stared between the grumbling Patty and the glaring Sanji, completely confused. Everyone at this restaurant was crazy. These chefs acted like thugs, as if they were pirates on a pirate ship. What kind of restaurant was this? His thoughts were interrupted when one of his men stumbled through the front door, breathing heavily. Lieutenant Full Body, he yelled, panic in his voice. We have a problem, he escaped. Don Krieg's right-hand man, he attacked us and vanished. What?